Hello again. This is the Everyday Economist. My previous channel was deleted, and that's besides the point, but because of popular demand, and in the previous channel, the videos I made about the Great Reset, the rise of inflation as we hear on the news, and all that, I got a lot of questions about trying to connect these ideas together in one video because those were made in 2 to 3 minute videos explaining everything, and I was asked if I could make a big video and a large video to discuss everything in relation to one another so everyone can have an idea of what the big picture is. And I kind of agree that's a really good idea. And that's the point of this, because on the news you hear a lot of white noise and jargon and distractions and a lot of big terms being thrown around and actually inconsistent news about what's going on. And the purpose of this video is to provide you a very easy to understand everyday understanding of what's going on in the economy. So by the end of this video, you can actually go up to your friend or a random stranger, say in a bar, and you can explain the A to Z of the economy from start to finish of what's going on with oil prices, what's going on with inflation, what's the role of Bitcoin and why is it so popular and rising, what's going to happen to the US dollar, and what's going on with China in relation to our debt and deficit spending. So all these big concepts that you might have heard, I'm sure all of you have heard these words that I just used on the news, but are not familiar of the internal dynamics. I'm going to be explaining to you all these terms in very simple terms so that by the end of this video you understand and I can actually explain it to another individual just as good as an economist could. And as this video is, you don't need any prerequisites, you don't need any background info, I will explain everything. It's going to be a longer video, bear with me, you're going to get through it and understand whatever's going on. And the several messages I got to start this video, and I guess the influence for it was about the video I made previously on the channel that got deleted about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and what their plan was. And that basically was a plan of being dependent on individuals who own assets. So the future that they were predicting is one where there was going to be no asset owners and it's going to be a renter's world. And you're going to be renting everything from your home to the tools in your house to appliances to your car and everything from big whatever, big corp, big pharma, big agro, big tech, big banks, military, whatever. So the list goes on and on. That was the premise for making this video. And in this video, I'll just show you what topics we're going to discuss because it's going to be much more expansive. So just as an average Joe, you could be watching the news or not even paying real attention, but you could have some real questions. And the common questions I get that I hope that this video will answer is, why is there, first of all, such a disconnect between the economy and the stock market? Labor participation, the unemployment rate, all these things are not doing as great as they should be, yet we have a stock market that's topping record high after record high on the week. The other question I get is, what's going on with our debt? Why is the government printing so much money? Do they have to print this much money or do they not have to print this much money? Another question I get is, why is Bitcoin so popular all of a sudden? Why is it rising so fast? What's going on with all these cryptocurrencies? Lastly, the question I get often is in relation to China. What's going on with China? Why is all of a sudden so much hostility between China? Is it related to what happened in 2020 or was it something that was happening before? Or is this related to the petrodollar and what I mentioned in the last slide, which is the Great Reset? So all these things that I just mentioned to you are actually related. They're not you can't understand them in isolation. So the point of this video is, if you watch it till the end, I'm going to be explaining everything to you in a manner that regardless of your academic background or your understanding of economics, you can go up to your friend or average person in the bar and explain to them everything that I just mentioned. What's going on with oil prices? What's going on with inflation? Why is the economy so disconnected from the stock market? What's going on with Bitcoin? What's the role of China? All these things, you can answer them as good, if not better, than an economist could, because you're explaining to them in very simple terms. And I guess Einstein was the one who said, the mark of someone who understands something is their ability to explain it. And by the end of this video, I hope you can at least understand it well enough so you could explain it to people around you, and you could be an expert on these topics by the end of this video. And lastly, I want to talk about this point where we discuss how you can better position yourself, because you could say, well, if there's this big economic crash that's coming, what am I supposed to do? Am I screwed? Well, there are certain things I'm doing, and you could use it as suggestion based on what I'm doing in terms of how to better prepare yourself and mitigate against the risks that will come as a result of this big crash, because someone has to pay again for the mismanagement by the central bankers and the Federal Reserve. And I say that because all these topics you see here, the underlying theme in all these topics goes back to the central banks and the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. What goes on in that building has a direct impact on all of these topics, every single one. And that is another reason I made this video, because a lot of people unfortunately don't understand the great influence that the Federal Reserve has, how much influence they have in your everyday life. And people don't pay attention to it when it comes to elections or voting, and they don't pay attention to it when raising issues to their fellow politicians. That's the key issue at heart in this video, the Federal Reserve. And you will see at the end of this video why the Federal Reserve and the unmitigated power it has corrupts and brings about gross mismanagement regarding the exacerbation of problems related to each and every single topic covered here. So let's begin. The breakdown of the video and this presentation is going to basically fall into three parts. We're going to be discussing the present, beginning with the present, then going into the past and seeing how we got here. Because in the present, we all know what the news is and what the implications are. We're feeling it every day with inflation, with unemployment, and everything that's going on terribly in the economy. And we have to understand what happened in the past to understand what's going on in the current time. And then lastly, all the topics I included in the last slide with the headings, we're going to talk about how all those are going to come ahead. I'm going to make a few predictions, and they're going to be based on history. They're going to be based on academic and economic models that have been used previously and shown considerable results successfully. And we're going to basically close off on a few of the topics like the Great Reset, what's going to happen with China, and what will really happen in the crash that I predict that is going to happen in terms of the debasement of the USD and the political instability and the economic instability and implications that come with that. And that's the point of this video. I mean, you could be an average Joe who goes about living their life, not caring about inflation. Yeah, it bothers you, but you know what? It just happens in the background. It doesn't bother you. If you're that type of person, then this video is not for you and you shouldn't waste your time watching it. But if you want to learn more and are interested about what the implications are, how you can better hedge yourself against them, and what that crash that's going to come is really about, then you should be investing the time to watch this video. So let's look at today. We're at a point where we have record levels of inflation. I mean, sure, the stock market's hitting new highs and new records, and that's not far from the inflation issue, but it's also inflation's also hitting new records. And again, when I said you have to be tuned out and you can still understand this, is because you go grocery shopping, you look at the housing market, look at your rent, look at your car insurance and the car expense. All these are going up per month at a level that's not been seen for many years. And with this comes obviously the great economic divide and chasm we have in terms of wealth inequality and all the issues related to that. Why is there the 1% and the 99%? Is it valid? Is it not valid? We'll talk about that as well. And we also see as a consequence of this, I mean, this has been going on for many years, but it's becoming ever more so apparent about the winners and losers of this new economy that we've had since the lockdowns. We've seen concentrations and pockets of wealth forming, and this is not new. Again, as I said, we have Wall Street, big pharma, big tech, big agro, military industrial complex, and the whole 9 yards, everything related to that. And all this, while this is going on domestically, in the backdrop of this, you take a step outside of the United States, you have the start of the Chinese century, which is worthwhile paying attention to, because as many people like to say that they're two independent events, you're going to be shocked about how these things are intertwined and actually are causal, have a causal relationship, which frankly not a lot of people in the media and out there talk about. So let's look at it. So how we got in this mess. I mean, these are headlines that I'm sure many of you have seen. Inflation is rampant, not just in the US, but you see down here in in Germany and in Europe. We've also been having, I know I have a lot of viewers in Europe and also in Southeast Asia, sending me emails with the previous channel, letting me know that they've also seen inflation within the past year and a half. And it's no mistake and no accident. I mean, America is at the forefront, is ground zero for inflation, and that inflation, I will explain how, when America does something, it has a multiplier effect for the rest of the world. There's that famous saying in economics where if America catches the cold, the world catches the flu, the worst kind of it. So we'll see how that affects going forward. And this is again a chart of consumer price index. We can see these prices have been steadily increasing. I mean, this is an inflection point if you want to draw a line in the sand, which is a very interesting year, which I will explain to you in great length. We start from the 1970s, and now it's just completely off the charts. They can barely fit this graph in this chart about the consumer price index, which is a measure of inflation, albeit my estimate is inflation's much higher than the numbers they're reporting. Because if you know anything about the consumer price index, which by the way is a measurement of how we calculate inflation, what they do is economists at the Fed take what they call a basket of goods. They take average household consumer items like grocery items, housing, cars, and all that, and they basically track the price year after year, and they record the change, and you see it's going up. Now, my understanding of it is that they're downplaying this. And it's not some conspiracy. I can, for example, give you an explanation with owner's equivalent rent, which is the way they calculate the price of housing, which is ridiculous. Owner's equivalent rent is how much someone would get rent to basically give up their home for the same price, which is nonsense. It's a terrible metric to calculate for the price of a home. I mean, the most obvious is the price of the home, but that's not what's included in CPI. I mean, and you didn't know this. I bet they don't say this in the news, but the price of the home is actually not calculated in this number. Owner's equivalent rent, and you don't even need to know what it is, I just briefly explained. Well, basically, it went up by about 2% in the past year, whereas housing, if you took the price alone, went up by 20%. But that's not included here. The only figure that's included here is this 2%. So if it was 20%, this graph would be much higher, and that's just housing. They do all these fugazi economics when it comes to food items and transportation items and car parts and shelter and all that. So CPI already, when it's being downplayed by the Fed, is already record level high. Now imagine what it is if we actually report it as it should be, when we just calculate the price as is, and it will be much higher. So we know something's going on already. I mean, it's not looking good. And we also see that the unemployment rate, since the lockdowns, we had this record, like since the Great Depression, unseen levels of unemployment. Thankfully, they're starting to come down, and it's not to the level where it was before. You see, before the lockdowns, before March of 2020, we're at this level slightly above 2.5. We haven't hit that level yet, and we still have ways to go. We're at 5.4 right now. If we could get it to 2.5, that would be a good day in America, but it's going to be a while till we get there. And this is again showing where we are right now in terms of unemployment. We talked about prices. This is unemployment. And this is the money supply, which is going to be a central topic of this video and a central focus of this video. We see when March of 2020 occurred, something crazy happened. I mean, you don't even need to know anything about economics. If I showed you this graph and you knew nothing about economics, you would take a pause. You're like, wait a minute, what's going on? And you have every right to be concerned, because this is the money that's in circulation, that's been printed by the Federal Reserve with no oversight or jurisdiction or anyone to tell them what are you doing. And we're going to talk about the effect of this in the video, but this is just a very basic overview of what's going on, basically a graphical summary. Currency in circulation also going on. M1 is a little bit different because it also includes cash accounts and current accounts, but this is basically the cash that's in circulation. Crazy amounts of money printed. You see this little increase in 2010? This was right when the financial crisis happened, towards 2008, 2009, late 2008, early, and that was our response to the Great Recession. I mean, the Federal Reserve believed that if they printed that amount, that they would basically be well off when it came to the recession. And this is the response to the lockdowns. Some might say it's overkill, some might say it's justified, others might say it's too early to answer. I will discuss that in this video as well to see if it's overkill or not, and why they're not, again, talking about it out there, and why the public should know this. And this is, again, reverse repos, which you don't really need to know. I mean, reverse repos, and very put simply, is basically a federal pawn shop. The banks there's so much money in the system right now. The banks have so much money that they're basically going to the Fed, putting it in the Federal Reserve, and getting treasury bills in return for one night. And then the next morning, the Fed buys those treasuries back from the banks and pays them a very, very small amount of interest. It's nothing. It's negligible. I mean, the yields they can get investing this market in the stock, investing this money in the stock market will be much higher. That's why there's a lot of people raising their eyebrows, because people are saying, well, why are banks putting their money in the Federal Reserve? Basically, it's a bank for the banks, the Federal Reserve. They're parking their money in the vaults of the Federal Reserve. Why are they not investing it in the market? Do they see something we don't? I mean, they're crazy not to invest with these returns that we're having. Quarter after quarter, the market's beating record returns, and people are left wondering, well, why are they not doing this? Good question. Maybe it's because they have fractional reserve requirements from the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed in after the 2008 financial crisis. Maybe it could be other reasons, but again, we'll discuss this. Again, this is an overview. Just sit tight, we'll get to it. So how we got here. This is important in understanding the mess that we're in. And you can't understand the mess that we're in without understanding how we got here. And that's basically could be explained in two parts. There's three stages, but within the second stage, we see that it's broken up into two parts. And it really started, I mean, the modern world order when it comes to the American century practically started after 1945. The century before that, the 19th century, was the British century. I mean, the British ruled the world. After two world wars, their treasuries became depleted, they were bankrupt, and their infrastructure had to be built from the ground up. They were bombed heavily, and they lost a lot of soldiers and men and civilians in those wars, whereas America, barely, not a single bomb was dropped on mainland USA. So in terms of who got off the best deal out of the World War II was America. They were in the position economically to take over the world with their economy and with their political prowess. And that basically happened in this agreement, the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. So after World War II, or during the end of it, when the Allies knew that it was basically over, the Allies representatives from all the major Allied countries met in a place called Bretton Woods in the US. And they basically formed this agreement of economic cooperation and basically creating a gold standard. Because some of you might know this, but before World War II, there was a gold standard, where it was very simple that you couldn't print money. It had to be tied to the number of gold bars you had in a vault. And that caused some problems, liquidity problems, especially in a recession, because what happens in a recession, right? When you're in a recession, you have to stimulate the economy. How do you stimulate the economy from the perspective of the government? You print money. But you can't print money if there's a gold standard tying you down. So a lot of the countries went off that old gold standard prior to World War II. So economists got together and said, okay, guys, the old gold standard didn't really work. It wasn't flexible. It was very rigid. How can we improve it? Because it had some really appealing qualities in the sense that it didn't allow countries and governments to print money off the rails and like there's no tomorrow. So let's work around this to basically come up with a solution. And the solution they did, it was called the Bretton Woods System. Basically did three things. Number one, it was established the GATT, basically generally agreed upon trade agreements on trade and tariffs, basically established the rules and the playbook for how countries trade. It then established the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And the reason the IMF and the World Bank were there is to specifically address the problems I just mentioned prior to the gold standard, the old gold standard, which was very rigid. So now, let's say you want to print money, your economy is in a dump, but the gold standard is not going to let you. So your only solution is to go off the gold standard. That was the old gold model. But under this new model, you can go to the IMF, get a loan, don't have to print money, it's someone else's money, someone else's balance of printing, and you use that money to stimulate your economy recovers, it grows, and then you pay back that debt to the IMF, and same with the World Bank. So that was there basically to fix the issues of the old world order. And it also established the gold. Basically, gold was convertible to $35 an ounce. You can take it to a bank and give you $35 an ounce. And FDR kind of changed that a little bit, but all you need to know is that after this system, it ushered in the golden age of economics. I mean, there are economies on the left like Keynes, but there are also economists on the right. They all agree that the period from 1944 to 1971, when Nixon went off the gold standard and basically ended the Bretton Woods system, this was the golden age of economics, literally the opposite of what we're seeing today. We had, during that era, extremely low levels of unemployment. record low levels of inflation, very stable economies. Basically, you had recessions and very periods of high growth, but they were much more stable. You didn't have massive levels of growth. We also didn't have massive crashes like the Great Recession. It was very linear, if you will, and it was very stable, very predictable, very fine. And basically, we went off that gold standard in 1971, which I will explain to, and that's basically when the fiat system was created. All the hell that we know today started in 1971 up until 2009. You can call that Fiat 1, basically, because there was different levels of printing. I mean, there was printing from 1979 1 to 2009, and then there was printing from 2009 to 2020, March of 2020, and now it's completely gone off the rails, which is why I believe, I mean, many people could just say there's two, but I think we should classify it as a third one, because what they're doing with printing is absolutely crazy and asinine, and we'll get to it in a moment. So this is the Bretton Woods System. This is Maynard Keynes, a famous economist from the UK, famously predicted, I mean, as a British person, you would think after World War I, he was there at the Treaty of the Versailles, and he was one of the very few people to say, hey guys, let's not be too harsh on Germany. And he famously predicted World War II right at the end of World War I. He said, if we crack down too hard on Germany, if we don't cooperate as the economies of Europe through cooperation and building each other up as economies, we're going to have another war on our hands that may be worse than the one we just had, the Great War we just had. And it was frankly correct in predicting World War II, because Germany was put in a very tight position as punishment. He said we shouldn't punish them, and he got a lot of flack for that. I mean, as a British, if you saw the horrors that Germany put on you as a British person, you would say, well, to hell with the British, to hell with the Germans, burn them all down. And bomb it to pieces. But he said, wait a minute, let's put our emotions aside, our sense of national pride aside, and stay sober and focused and think about what we should do. So this is Maynard Keynes at Bretton Woods, and he famously was, I guess they paid more attention to him the second time, knowing that he was right. And basically, he was instrumental with a few other famous economists from the US and whatnots, Woods and whatnots, to come up with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the gold standard 2.2, 2.2, if you want to call the old gold standard 1.2, whatever you want. But he was instrumental in all of this, in the Bretton Woods system. And you can see here, this is the gold, this is the period I was talking about, from the end of 1944 to 1971, we had income inequality at very stable levels. And you can see how there's a before and after, where we had a fiat system after and a kind of wacky Federal Reserve and a broken gold standard before. And this is why it's called the golden era of economics. By the way, nothing to do with the gold bars that was in play from that period. It's just golden because of all the great things it did for the world economies of the world. It had its problems, it wasn't perfect, but comparatively you can see that it was a godsend. And I said it wasn't perfect because there were oppositions to it. I mean, basically in 1961, there was a gold crisis, right? Because the economies of the world started growing, and there wasn't enough gold to match the demands of the hungry and thirsty economies of Europe and America, and there was a gold crisis. So America came out and established the London Gold Pool, where it's basically kind of like the World Bank for gold, where you can exchange gold and fix balance of payment issues in the short term. And America was fine. And this was mostly an issue observed, the gold crisis in Europe, especially France. They started getting some inflation and levels of employment, and Charles de Gaulle, who was the head of the nation at the time, started getting a little feisty with America, because America was the only country, they established themselves as the world reserve, right? Winners write the history of the world, and they also get the benefits. America became the world reserve currency. What does that mean? In simple terms, it means that America is the only country on earth that can pay for their imports in their own dollars. Other countries have to buy USD to buy goods from the US. America, they just print USDs and buy goods from the rest of the world. They convert it. America is the only one that can do that. And this caused resentment. I mean, obviously, other countries get jealous when this has happened. They called America's marvelous secret of a deficit without tears. America could always print money and get themselves out of a deficit without tears. This is as a side note, this is usually accredited to Charles de Gaulle, but it was actually his economic minister, Jacques Rueff, who basically coined this term exorbitant privilege as well, that said America has this exorbitant privilege
printing without any problems, because whenever you print, you have inflation. What America basically exported is inflation. They basically printed money and shipped it abroad when they bought goods. So you had USD sitting in French vaults, or you had gold bars also sitting in UK vaults, and they didn't know what to do with it, and they got angry with it. They said, well, we want to cash it in. So they brought their gold vaults to Fort Knox, which was famous for holding all the gold bars for America and the rest of the world, and wanted to cash it in. And this slowly but surely in the late 60s started pushing pressure on America to basically kind of figure out their balance of payments issues, because we were running out of gold. There was not enough gold to match all the currency out there, and there was also something else going on. There was the Vietnam War. Maybe you've heard of it. It was a very costly and expensive war. It was in the height of the Cold War. America and Nixon specifically didn't want to lose face. He wanted peace with honor, but he also wanted to fight the war. But you can't print money to fight the war. See how the gold standard keeps the military-industrial complex in check? The Bretton Woods System kept it in check. Nixon wanted to print money to go to war with Vietnam and increase troops and bombs and all of that. And you might say, well, the Vietnam War was a proxy war. Who cares? It was this minor distraction in the Far East. There is an interesting factoid. Did you know that more bombs were dropped on Vietnam than bombs were dropped in the entirety of World War II? You take all the countries in World War II and you add up all the bombs that were dropped on them from the Axis, from the Allies, it doesn't come close to the bombs that the U.S. dropped in Vietnam. So it wasn't this minor conflict in a distant land in the middle of rice paddies in some Southeast Asian jungle. It was a major conflict, and it had huge economic costs, expenses, both in terms of money and also in terms of life. And Nixon knew this, but he couldn't. He was backed into a corner. He had on one hand Charles de Gaulle barking in his ear saying we want to convert our gold into US dollars. And on the other hand, he has his own domestic problems. He wanted to print money, but he couldn't, because there was the gold standard. You have to print money in proportion to the number of gold you have sitting in vaults. So he basically ended the gold standard. He came out of it. He said, we're going to stop the convertibility of gold in 1971. And past August was actually the anniversary of it. And because of that, the Bretton Woods system collapses. And this is the year that we get the birth of the monetary fiat regime, basically the birth of the current world order that we're living in, which I call circus economics, and you'll see why. Literally everything after 1971 goes to hell. And you say, well, why does everything go to hell? And I'm not just talking about the economy, literally everything. And because it's the economy, stupid. This is a famous saying from the Bill Clinton administration that kind of shows that you take care of the economy, everything else will take care of it. And this is true. I will show in a few slides why. You take care of the economy, social unrest will get taken care of. You take care of the economy, education, healthcare, military spending, a stable society, everything else will take care of it. Economy is the secret sauce to running a country. You take care of the economy, everything else will take care of itself, or at least 99%. And you'll see why. Let's look here. 1971, what happened? We went off the gold standard. Nixon took us off Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods system ends. The so-called golden era of economics that was established by the Bretton Woods system from 1944 to 1971 ends. And income inequality in America, surprise, surprise, after 1971, it increases. So you see how over here, perfectly balanced. Everyone, there's no 1% or 99%. There is rich and poor, there is a middle class, but it's all stable and healthy. 1971, we go off the gold standard, everything goes crazy. Trends in minimum wage. Look here, and minimum wage was tracking productivity adjusted for inflation up until 1971, and it goes off the rails. Productivity goes up, wages don't follow. Why, I wonder. Again, you look at inflation, stable prices. Then we have 1971. Inflation's actually going down. 1971, we have this huge surge on top of the oil crisis that happened during the Yom Kippur War, when the Arabian countries didn't give America their oil because of their support for Israel. You had huge inflation on top of that, but it was also because it's going off the gold standard and unfeathered printing like there is no tomorrow to print for the Vietnam War. You had huge levels of inflation, and we really haven't recovered. I mean, you see how this crazy it is, and this goes up to 2009. When I say we haven't recovered, you say, well, over here, what are you talking about? 2009 we're recovered, but I'm talking about you'll see the graph was expanded further, that we're completely off the rails. This looks like a walk in the park compared to where we are now. And we also look at the federal funds rate, which is a fancy word again for inflation. I will explain everything in simple terms for you to understand. Can't really see it here, but again, I circled it here, 1971. Interest rates go up to combat inflation and they come down. So you see massive spikes up to 20%, massive spikes down. And you really haven't had stable interest rates ever since. Complete joke. And you also see the price of oil. Look at how stable the price of oil was. Remember how cheap gas used to be at the gas station from the 40s onward? We go off here, America goes up to Bretton Woods, but we also have the oil crisis. I've read a lot of literature that shows the oil crisis wasn't the cause for the increase in the price of oil. It was the fact that the US dollar became devalued relative to the price of oil that contributed to the increase in price of oil. Because if you don't know, because America is a world reserve currency, commodities market, gold, oil, silver, iron, all these things, steel, they're all priced relative to USD. So when the USD goes down, these things go up. The price of gold goes up when the US dollar goes down because it's relative. And the same thing happened here. In 1971, we started, and through 1974, when excessive printing kicked in, the USD became devalued, and we see how the price of oil has completely become unstable and off the charts. It's not because all of a sudden the world needed more oil. I mean, ask yourself, does this seem logical that after 1974, everyone became more industrious? No, the USD became devalued, so the price of oil relative to the US dollar also went bonkers crazy. And it's not just gold. I mean, gold also, we had a gold crisis in that same period. We had all these crises happening at the same time, so it's not a coincidence there. And this is cost push. This is a fancy term again for inflation. Cost push is, well, if I'm, say, a business owner, my prices of goods are going up, I'm also going to increase my prices because I have to make profit. And I'm basically cost pushing. What does that mean? I'm pushing the cost that's been imposed on me as a business owner onto you, the buyer. So you have to pay more to make up for me having higher input costs. And again, 1971, everything goes crazy. We have higher highs and lower lows. We say goodbye to stability. And remember when I said you take care of the economy, everything else takes care of itself? Well, look at this. Another interesting relationship. You can say, well, correlation doesn't equal causation, but I ask you, why is it that in 1971 everything went crazy? Number of prisoners in the US, 1971, income inequality goes crazy because of our printing. And that means that the social unrest is higher. What happens when we have social unrest? People protest, they riot, they commit crimes, they get pushed out of their homes, their rents go up, inflation makes them lose their jobs, they can't make rent, they can't make the mortgage, they commit crime, they turn to drugs, they turn to illegal activities, and that's what happens. They go to prison. And it's no wonder that in 1971, when the economy goes crazy, the society also goes crazy as well. And you take care of the economy, everything else will take care of itself. And it's not just input crisis. I mean, you as a taxpayer and as a voter, you have to fill your tank with gasoline. That gasoline, remember, went up in the last slide. So the crazy world begets crazy things. And this is the printing that we see here. We have the fiat system. Again, this is fiat 1 that I introduced to you at the beginning of the video, 1971 to 2008, 2009. This is how much money it's been printed in circulation. Look at it. I mean, here we went to World War II and we kind of printed money to fight World War II. But with the Vietnam War and everything else that came after, because we didn't have a gold standard to keep us disciplined, we didn't have the Bretton Woods standard to keep us in check, politicians and the Fed went crazy. Look at how much printing they did. And this is, of course, the 2008 financial crisis, where we printed money not to help the everyday folk, but to bail out corporations and big banks so they don't go bankrupt. And again, this is the money that's been going up. This is fiat 1, and after that, this is why I differentiate into fiat 1 from 71 to 2009. And then we printed so much money that it deserves its own fiat cycle. Now, we can also further break it down, because if you look at it from just a monetary perspective, sure, we have fiat 1 from 1971 to 2009, but something very important happened in the year 2000 that I think deserves its own mention. In the year 2000, China joined the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, And this was a Clinton thing, and then everyone was cheering on for it. They said, well, China's going to be great. Let's introduce it into the World Trade Organization. We're going to open up China. We had people from New York Times like Thomas Friedman and all the bunch saying that if we open up China, China's going to liberalize and they're going to adopt Western values and they're going to be our best friends. And we're going to be two economic superpowers in bed, and we're going to rule the world together, and it's all going to be sunshine and rainbows. And you had everyone on all sides of the spectrum, from the left and the right and the center, approving of this. You had noble economists praising this. You had people who went to the top Ivy League institutions saying this is a great idea. Let's include China in the global trade. It's going to be a great time for America and the rest of the world. You had even libertarians who you would think would be against this. I mean, Jesse Ventura. You don't get more libertarian than this. He was the Minnesota governor at the time, and he was actually the head of the operation from the U.S. side to get China into the WTO in 2000. And so blame goes around all sides. I mean, you get liberals like Bill Clinton, you have Republicans who supported this, you also have libertarians. So there's not a single person who really was a major person who was against this. We all kind of blindly followed it through, and we gave China the benefit of the doubt that they will adopt Western values, that they will come to us and be our friends and allies and everything, all of such. It's going to be like the Marshall Plan in Europe. Obviously, 20 years later, we see that things did not go as planned. And this is the effects of the WTO. Instead of getting China to be our best friends and opening up their economy and becoming a democracy like we have here in the West, we basically cleaned house when it came to our manufacturing sector. The remaining domestic industries that were left, that were surviving when China cost cuts and basically has cheap labor, the ones that were left got bought out by the big boys like Amazon and all the other pockets of wealth that I mentioned in the beginning of the video. And this basically fast-tracked the issues that we already had from 1971 to 2000. If you say that the world economic regime died in 1971, 2000 was the year it got buried, because this exasperated and sped up all this vicious cycle that resulted as a result of the issues that we had because of it, as I showed earlier. And the divisions and political unrests further were exacerbated because of the growing gap in income inequality. And this is basically Amazon. When I say pockets of wealth, I got one guy asked me, what do I mean? Well, this is what I mean. Look at how many industries one company has their foot in. This was unheard of before. We used to have the DOJ used to go in, and the antitrust division, and basically break up these companies like they did with Standard Oil and the Rockefellers, but nothing's happening because I guess they don't understand how technology works. We have old lawmakers who don't know what Facebook is, who don't know what Amazon is. But look at this. They have their foot in the door of all these industries, and they're top players in it. They're cost cutting, and some of these industries are actually losing money. They basically put their average price below their competitors' average cost, and they're basically losing money because their other sectors are profitable, and they're losing money to gain market share. You lose money in the short term, drive out everyone, and once everyone's drived out, come in, clean house, and establish yourself as the head honcho in that industry, which is ridiculous. What you see here in the cloud and the streaming business and the movie review business, if that's even an industry, in the music business, in speaker businesses, all the e-commerce, obviously, they're all top of the top dog. And same with Apple. I mean, we have Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google. These are the big boys, the monopolies and the pockets of wealth that are basically in charge. These are the beneficiaries of the post-1971 and WTO special interest groups that are the beneficiaries of that economic regime. And this graph I really like because it shows how big Apple is. So if you took Apple's AirPods business, forget their iPhones and their iPods and their iMacs and the whole iCrap, just take the AirPods. If Apple sold AirPods and nothing else, and that was their entire business model, they would generate more revenue than Adobe, Nvidia, AMD, Spotify, Square, and Twitter, Snap, which is Snapchat, and Shopify. Isn't that crazy? One product they have is outselling and out-generating, bringing in more money than all these companies. Now, is it because the AirPods are these fantastic, life-saving, insulin-like invention? Of course not. It's a piece of plastic that you put in your ear that looks funny. It's because they're a monopoly. That's why they're able to extract such rents and such high costs. They sell stands that are basically a piece of steel that's like $3,000. Why are they able to do that? Because they have no competitors. They have Samsung, but in the luxury cell phone business, they really have no competitors. That's why they're able to bring in this. If you had a free market economy that didn't favor monopolies, Apple would be down here. The AirPods business would be junk, would be zippity-doo. But because they're a monopoly, they're able to have monopoly-style revenues, and it's evident in this graph, which is ridiculous. And we have media consolidation. I mean, forget AirPods. This is more important. This is where we get our news. All of our news organizations, the big major players, owned by only a few companies. No one talks about this, but here you go. You got Fox, you got ABC, ESPN, and Pixar, all owned by Disney. News Corp owns Fox News. You wake up in the morning, watch Fox News, and you get your newspaper at the door, and when you come back, you get a New York Post on the way home from the subway. All are written and organized and influenced by the same board of directors. Same with Comcast. Your sports even, ESPN, Time Warner, CNN, HBO, and Time Magazine. I mean, you think these are all separate companies with separate intentions and incentives, but it's all the same show. You're all being fed the same thing by the pound by 4 or 5 people in charge. No one talks about this, and I guess maybe that's why my previous channel was deleted. I'm not a big believer in conspiracies, but this is an interesting graph to look at. And again, look at consumer products. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All these products come from 9 companies. Did you know that Kraft is in charge of the Crush drink, or the A&W, or Canada Dry? Did you know that Quaker and PepsiCo is the owner of KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut? Maybe that's why they don't have Coca-Cola when you go in their restaurants. Did you know Procter & Gamble owns Brown, or Lacoste, or Boss? Most people don't know these things because our economy is run by the same people, and they branch it off like this so people don't pay attention, and it's also favorable for the purpose of taxation, because you act as a small guy, but you have a big guy running you. You have a big style operation with a small guy mentality. Very smart. You have to give it to them. And all of this happened because of the WTO and because we went off the gold standard and the Bretton Woods System, but specifically the WTO. Because companies are allowed to export their cost offshore, they're able to play these funky games and consolidate power without the government doing anything about antitrust. And before you know it, there's only a handful of people who own everything, and the rest of us are left fighting for the scraps. And this is a graph I really like, and again, going back to Amazon from Scott Galloway, a professor at NYU. He basically shows the percentage of American households that own Amazon Prime. More American households have an Amazon Prime account than more American households own guns, or go to church, or own landline, or voted in the 2016 elections. And it's almost as close as people who decorate trees for Christmas. Isn't that crazy? 64% of American households have an Amazon Prime account. Is it because Amazon Prime is this phenomenal invention? Sure, maybe a little bit is part of it. They're a good business. But it's also because they're a monopoly. They have no competitors. I'm sure if Americans in the world had more options to choose from when it came to buying goods from the internet, this number would not be 64%. If that's not screaming monopoly, DOJ, I don't know what is.
And this again is another slide that shows Amazon's market cap, and as comparable to the GDPs of various nations around the world. And the countries that are highlighted here have a lower GDP. Their entire economy is worth less in dollar terms than the value of Amazon. And just a quick definition is, for market cap is basically if you were to buy all the shares in Amazon, if you were to, how much money would you need to become 100% owner of Amazon? The amount of money you need is going to be more than the GDPs of these countries here. For example, Korea, Australia, Spain, Mexico, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And this just shows you the extent of Amazon's size and phenomenal growth, and again, facilitated in part by their monopoly status. And lastly, this is another starking metric that shows the extent of Amazon's reach in various industries. The underlying concept of them demands that they have a proper shipping and logistical system, and you can see here that in in comparison with FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service. And they really began in 2015, Amazon, in terms of really figuring out their logistics systems. And in the past 7 years, they've built the third largest package delivery system. And it just took them 7 years to surpass FedEx. They're well on their way to pass UPS, and soon they're going to dwarf all the other ones. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the not so distant future, FedEx and UPS basically disappeared from the market, either through a bankruptcy or an acquisition. But Amazon's coming for their lunch. And this again goes back, you ask yourself, why is this happening? How is this happening? Well, the unregulated and unmitigated access of these big companies like Amazon, even Google, Facebook, and Apple shows you that this is not really a free market system anymore, because this is an oligarchy similar to Russia. I mean, Russia, well, it's a little different because these individuals over here were beneficiaries of the Soviet Union's collapse, where the industries that were controlled by the state were handed over to the free market. And these people, in exchange for their loyalty to Vladimir Putin, entered a very close economic circle where they were handed the keys to the industries such as oil, natural gas, automobile, all the industries left over from the Soviet Union. And we know this is the situation there in exchange of loyalty for power, because over here, number two, this is, I believe, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was one of these oligarchs, one of the richest men in Russia, and he was handed the keys to the oil companies. And because he was not loyal, as the other ones were, he basically went to jail and lost all that power and the benefits that came with it. So that's why I say it's a little bit different. But the regulatory capture, which is basically that the industries are too big to be regulated because they have so much influence in terms of lobbying. If Facebook spends exorbitant amounts of money on lobbying, we see it with Amazon, we see it with Google, and they go through these little tactics of changing their names, like Facebook recently did, changing it to Metaverse, so they come under less scrutiny. It's not just a marketing ploy, it's also a legal tactic to change the discussion and change the name and say, well, if Facebook's behaving bad, that's not the entire company, dear Senate and senators, but it's one aspect of our company. So it just shows this regulatory capture aspect in regards to how these companies are too big, too entrenched, and have too much influence in terms of handling who oversees them. They are the same people who oversee them. The senators, they get paid, they turn a blind eye. So it really shows you that we're not living in a free market system. It's not a fair market system, it's oligarchy. And this is what Adam Smith warned us about in his Wealth of Nations, about letting wealth become too concentrated. And we're seeing evidence of this quite perfectly. And reflecting on all of this, the natural question to ask is, how do we get here? What was the situation that allowed this? And I know throughout the video I said the year 2000 is the year when China entered the WTO, but in reality, I mean, in 2000 the foundation was set, but the signing off treaty was in 2001. And this was essentially the watershed moment that opened the floodgates for concentrations of wealth within America, but also Europe and Canada, but specifically America. And the reason for this is because all the small competitors that could not move abroad were outcompeted by the bigger and larger players who were able to take advantage of lower costs from abroad. And it gutted out the domestic industries, and whatever was left was few and far between of these large companies, the monopolies within their respective industries, like Google. And we see it also with a lot of the manufacturing companies. There used to be a lot of car companies, lumber producers, a lot of these small industries, even within them. If once you actually sit down and take a look, you'll notice that the concentration of wealth centered around one or two companies has greatly increased at light speed levels after this date. And that's simply because of China's admission into the WTO, which was the ushered in a period of basically a new phase of economic history, which surely historians will look back and note this date as a watershed moment, specifically as the conflict between America and China develops more from a Cold War and maybe even into a hot war, but we'll see. And this again is a graphical interpretation and representation of that last slide. The year is 1999. All the blue countries are countries who, compared to China, have the United States as their largest trading partner. And we see it's basically the entire world, with the exception of North Korea, Iran, Central African countries. But for all practical purposes, all over the world, America is surpassed China in 1999, literally a year and a half before the WTO and China entering it. America had a huge lead. This is 1999. Remember this year. And we're going to compare it to what happened a few short years later. And we see here 2018. In the span of 19 years, less than 2 decades, China has completely usurped and replaced America as the largest trading partner for the overwhelming majority of the world. And this is a complete and direct result of China's ascension into the WTO, and all the wealth and the power that comes along with it has been given to China. So America has lost their trade power with the world. And don't think of this just as an economic value, but also think about it as geopolitical strategy. When you're a country's largest trading partner, you have a big carrot holding it over their head, and you have a lot of say in what they do. And this also is part and parcel of America's declining political influence around the world. Countries are more likely to consider their options and look at alternatives when America says to do something. And this is not to say if it's good or bad. This is just an observation of what's been happening in the past 20 years. And this is the result. And everything that I just mentioned to you, and this is why I distinctly emphasize we have to break these periods up to, first of all, understand how they all come together, but also how they play out individually. Yes, they're related, but they also play out separately. So the period of 2001 to 2009, this is going back to that Lehman Brothers slide, is often overlooked. And I say this because it's an unspoken handshake agreement with China. It's not reported as much, it's not talked about as much. We talk about WTO, I'm not the first to say it and talk about it, but what's often overlooked from the period where China joined till the Great Recession in 2009 is this unspoken handshake agreement. And what is this unspoken handshake agreement? Well, we let China into the WTO, we gave them all this wealth, and we gave them all this opportunity to trade with the world, and they usurped the position of America in terms of trade power. And in exchange, we buy goods from them. I mean, America is also doing a lot of trade with China, but China gets all this cash coming in from people buying their goods. And the unspoken handshake agreement is they take that cash and they convert it to USDs and they bring it back into America. This is the trade-off. We let them get all that money, but the deal was they get the cash, they convert it to USDs, and they come back to America and buy US treasuries and bonds. And for all practical purposes, what does this mean? This means that they're going to fund the US government's spending. They basically loan America money, they buy treasuries, and they give us the principal, and in exchange, what America has to do is pay back very little interest rates, although it adds up. It's in the billions of dollars that they get every year, but little by little, they're giving cash to America, and America takes that cash, and I guess the assumption was our politicians in America and elsewhere would be responsible. They would spend it on infrastructure, on research and development, but instead, the agreement has been that the cash was now being used for military endeavors abroad and corporate bailouts. And without this cash, America's Great Recession could have very well turned into depression because they used China's cash that they returned from their trade to bail out corporations. And this is, again, that unspoken handshake agreement. So I'm going to emphasize this again because it's so important and so often overlooked. America buys goods from China. China takes that cash, converts it into USDs, and sends it back to America. And they send it back as a form of investment, long-term investment, because they have so much cash they don't know what to do with it. So America's like, give it to us. We'll put it in our treasury. We'll give you a bond, a piece of paper that says we'll owe you back in, let's say, 10, 25, or 50 years, sometimes even 100 if it's a long-term dated bill. And in return, we get that cash, and America can do whatever it wants. America has a line of credit with China. They can do whatever the heck they want. And instead of using that money to build roads, improve infrastructures, we see what they did from the year 2000 when China got admitted to uh, 2009, the Great Recession, which is where I ended. I didn't end it in 2021. In 2009, something happened. We'll look at it, and the nature of this relationship changed. And this again is the 2008, the timeline of the 2008 financial crisis. And basically, all you need to know, if you will, a crash course of it, no pun intended, was in 2008, leading up to it, starting really in 2004, 5, 6, 7, and then up to the end of 8. You had big banks giving mortgages to people who really couldn't afford them. I mean, these were people with terrible credit ratings, with terrible spending habit, basically no savings in the account, and the banks just gave it to them because there's money to be made. And what is a mortgage? Well, a mortgage from the perspective of a bank is a piece of paper that entitles them to money on a periodic basis. And what they did is they took all these pieces of paper from the thousands and thousands of homes they had loaned money to, and they took all these papers, stacked them up together, gave it a fancy name like a mortgage-backed security, and got credit companies like AIG to give it a fake bozo rating like AAA, and they called it a financial instrument, and they sold this product, if you will, to other banks and all over the world as a great financial investment. And it was this game of hot potatoes. And as you can see here, Lehman Brothers was the firm that was stuck without a chair when the music stopped playing. And that caused a crash, that caused a domino effect. It really was felt in every corner of the world. It was a terrible crisis, one of the worst in history, and economists who've actually looked back at this have said that if the government didn't intervene and if it was let on to continue at this rate, it could have turned into the Great Depression. So the situation was very bad. And the reason why we need to understand this is because we have to also look at the terrible response the government had in terms of bailouts and also printing crazy amounts of money to conduct those bailouts and stimulate the economy. And this is basically a vicious cycle of irresponsible government management. Crisis happens, and then more irresponsible responses to that crisis that was caused initially because of an irresponsible government. So let's look at what happened. So we saw what happens when big banks give out mortgages to everyone with a vowel in their name and continue to blow smoke up people's kazoo with AIG and all these rating agencies. We see that the house of cards collapsed in spectacular fashion. And it took down billion-dollar industries with it. It created this domino effect, again, felt around the world. It goes back to that old age saying that when America sneezes, the world catches the flu. And that was correct. And what you had to do here, I mean, from the perspective of the American government and the Federal Reserve, you had to really print money to bail out the big banks. I mean, you're in a recession, so you already are short on current cash accounts from the Federal Reserve's perspective. So the only way to lift the economy back up again in a very artificial manner that is catered towards big corporations rather than the small average Joe is to print money. And print they did. Let's look at how much they print. And this right here is how much they print. Look at this. From the 1971 August, they go off the gold standard. Printing, 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 and then this is the crazy amount of money that was printed right up to the 2008 financial crisis. And we see when we had a gold standard, let's say from this period of onwards, it kept the government disciplined. They couldn't just print. They had the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and all the wars, and despite all of that and all the social programs, the square deal under Johnson, all those spending items, spending and printing of money was conservative. It was kept disciplined by a gold standard. And Nixon sees that they can't fight the Vietnam War without printing more money. They needed peace with honor or whatever they were planning, so they went off the gold standard. And you can clearly see, I mean, even if I didn't draw these lines, you would clearly understand that something happened in 1971 up to 2008. And this again is that amount that was injected into the economy as a result of 2008. Completely irresponsible. And you could know nothing about economics again and still know that this graph doesn't look right. It's something happened here, and you're absolutely right if your intuition is something is wrong, and that's irresponsible government combined with the Federal Reserve that is unbounded, unchained, and unrestricted. And this goes back to, I briefly mentioned this in the beginning of the video, but exporter of inflation. This shows, again, the economic behemoth that the United States is. When they lead, the world follows, good or bad. And famous saying in economics, again, is that when America catches the cold, the world catches the flu. So when America has inflation, then may God help the rest of the world. We see here that the Federal Reserve, in that last slide, we saw that huge spike after 2008, $3.9 trillion in 3 rounds. That doesn't matter, but it was about $4 trillion starting in November of 2008, and the majority of it was in following this period. And you could say, well, is inflation contained within the US? Absolutely not, because America, again, is an economic behemoth. So other countries, because of America's lack of responsibility, suffered. The Bank of England had to follow, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And they also had inflation. Japan also saw a rise in their asset purchases and inflation, and the European Central Bank, because Germany, Greece, and all the other Central European countries also had to follow. So you don't have to be an American to be concerned about this. Sure, you're at ground zero when you're in America, but if you're watching from England, if you're watching from Japan, if you're watching from Central Europe, you also have to be concerned about what America does, because when they print, you also have to print as well. And this brings us to the third chapter. Now, usually when you watch videos of economists talking about the development of economic history, they kind of break it off into 3 steps. Now, with regards to Bretton Woods, 1971 to 2001, this is important because that's the date we went off the gold standard again, and this is the date when China began its initial steps of joining the WTO and finalized it by November. 2001 to 2009, we saw what happened when China joined the WTO. America lost its trading power status as a global trading superhouse. And 2009, we saw how that international status and lack of it, frankly, reflected back in domestic strategy and domestic economic monetary policy in regards to printing. Crazy amounts of printing affected the world. And now I want to focus on the period from 2009 to 2015. You will notice that I have 2015 underlined. I want you to remember this year. This is the phase in economic history that very few people discuss, and the reason for that is something happened in 2015 that completely changed the dynamic of the relationship between China and the United States. So up to this point, they were a happy couple. Sure, they were not the best of friends, but they were happy. I mean, from the 70s, we saw Nixon trying to open up China for geopolitical reasons, and from 2000, we saw Bush and the final days of the Clinton administration trying to open up China from an economic sense. And they were friends with benefits. They had good relationships. They benefited. China allowed America to have capital and cashes to come out of the 2008 recession. But something happened in 2015, and I want you to pay close attention to this. So from 2009 to 2015, again, everything was good until late 2014 or early 2015. I put 2015 here because that's when the headlines started picking it up. And that's when China starts violating that unspoken handshake agreement. Remember that unspoken handshake agreement where China takes their trade surplus and sends it back to America by buying and providing America a line of credit? Well, in 2005, China violated the spirit of their agreement. How did they violate it? Well, let's take a look. So China currently has a 1.4 trade surplus with the United States since 2000. And they basically have increased that trade surplus year after year. So from China's perspective, they're getting a lot of money from America. And again, what were they supposed to do with that money? Send it back. And for the most part, they did. But look, China, and this is an article from right around that time, grew more picky about their debt because they took a second where they're like, wait a minute, we're not politically aligned with the United States. We know there are rivals. Now, yes, we have this unspoken handshake agreement, but what's going on here? And this, I would say, is probably the most important slide in this entire presentation. And if something you want to take away from this video, this is it. Because over here we have Wen Jiabao. I believe this was he was the first basically to raise awareness about China's relationship with America in relation to debt. And he basically said, why are we funding America? I mean, seriously, we have this trade surplus. we're making so much money from our trade. Why are we sending this money back to America so they can go fund their wars and come out of recessions? He basically, I mean, Wen Jiabao basically said, to hell with America. They could have went through a recession because of their irresponsible housing regulation and banking regulation, and because of our goodwill of sending that money back, they basically were able to save themselves from a depression. Why is that? Are they our allies? No, they don't give us that much in return. I mean, sure, they're trading with us, but what we give to them in return is not proportional in terms of what we're getting. So they basically started questioning the nature of their relationship. And again, this is a watershed moment because historically, if you know anything about China's domestic politics, under President Hu Jintao, he warned that China needs a peaceful rise and not to make too much enemies or too much noise. Basically, be the guy in the background, keep your head down, work, and don't bother anyone so they don't interrupt you. And this again goes back to Deng Xiaoping's era of patience, long-term growth, and thinking long-term, thinking in decades. And basically, your sole focus should not be geopolitics, but it should be, as the Chinese say, the Lao Bai Shi, which is the common people. Think about the common people. Tend to your own garden, as Voltaire says. Focus on that. And then comes Xi Jinping with his wolf warrior diplomacy and all the people part and parcel of that administration over here who basically are ethnic nationalists and want to think beyond China's borders. And they started here basically recalculating and adjusting their calculus with the United States and saying, well, we might have to violate this unspoken handshake agreement, and we might not have to be the ones sending America all this line of credit. Why should we? We're not getting anything in return. It's helping embolden our geopolitical rivals. Let's reconsider that relationship. And beginning in 2009, it was a wake-up call for China, and they realized how much they were helping America with their line of credit. So from 2009 to 2014, they really didn't act upon it. They just started questioning it. But slowly but surely, the nature of the relationship changed. And we see in 2016, they started in 2015, lowering the line of credit they were giving to America. And the way they did that is basically by decreasing their asset purchases. And by December, by end of 2016, for the first time, they were no longer the biggest foreign holder of U.S. debt. And this started to freak America the heck out. Because they said, if China's not going to provide us this line of credit, then we're kind of screwed, because we've been spending all this money recklessly, spending all the monies on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on corporate bailouts, because we always had, it's like playing with the house's money in a casino. We have China providing all this debt. Where are we going to get this money if China's not going to give it to us? And isn't it a coincidence that starting in 2016, when China started violating the nature of this agreement, U.S. politicians all of a sudden started becoming more hawkish on China and started becoming more aggressive on China in regards to foreign policy? Before that, the focus wasn't China. It was radical, it was the Middle East, it was extremism and religious fundamentalism. It was never China. And America was sending troops to the Middle East and all that. In 2016, America got a wake-up call, because America's always slow to react compared to China. And it was only in 2016 when the relationship and the nature of the dialogue started to get more hawkish. We saw more populist reactionary politicians like Trump, even the Democrats started to get more hawkish. But it didn't really happen until China violated the spirit of the agreement. And I think it's worth mentioning because it's not just a coincidence. And we see here again more articles from November 30th of that year. Central bank head says China must not monetize deficit. And they're absolutely right. China basically said, why are we funding America's deficits? They're talking about a firewall between fiscal and central banks. I personally like to call it a jade curtain. As I know Churchill said, it's between an iron curtain between the Soviet Union. Well, China said, let's put up a jade curtain between us and America, and we shouldn't be subsidizing all their deficits. And here again, we see that China and Japan, even Japan, who's an ally, started decreasing their asset purchases. China, this is the blue line, Japan is the blue line. They started decreasing, and so did China. And you can see the trend. It was increasing, 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 and then 2014, 2015 is when we had that watershed moment, when basically America started to panic because they were running out of cash. And we see here, this is a quick breakdown of top foreign owners of U.S. national debt. China and the U.S. decreasing and decreasing. Everyone's decreasing. No one wants U.S. treasuries. No one wants to subsidize the U.S. They want to keep that money in-house and spend it on their own people. And again, another graph showing the year 2015. If you draw a line from 2015 up, another watershed moment, percentage of total debt decreasing again significantly. It kind of wiped years of gains. And this is when America has to basically figure out what they're going to do, because China is not going to bail them out any longer. And this, I mean, can you really blame China? America put all their eggs in China's basket, and basically China is pulling the rug and saying the show's over and turning off the light and then taking out the fruit punch. And America is wondering, how dare they? Well, it's kind of your fault for putting all your eggs in China's basket. And betting the whole house on China basically was a faulty assumption of letting China in the WTO, because it doesn't just touch on the issue of debt. And also the assumption was, when they let China in the World Trade Organization, was that by allowing and opening up China to the rest of the world, they're going to liberalize, they're going to be a Western-style democracy. Very naive, very foolish. China's 3,000-year-old history, they look down on America. They don't consider America a country of their equal. Right or wrong, they think of America as youth. Go talk to any person living in China and try to get a sense of their national ethos, and you would quickly come to the realization that they don't consider America an equal. So this assumption that China somehow was going to adopt Western-style democracy was foolish. It was foolish in Afghanistan. It's foolish in China. And we see here again betting the house on China when the pandemic started and all the essential medical equipments were coming in from China. 60% of upwards of protective garments and everything. China basically said, to hell with that. We're going to serve our own people, and we're not going to give you our medical equipments. And that was the initial panic that happened with ventilators, with medical equipments, with N90 masks, and all of that sort. Again, goes back to betting the whole house on China. Can you really blame China? Well, that's a question you can answer. And the reason why this game went on, I mean, this was the assumption that, I don't believe that all the politicians who basically bet the house on China said this is a bad agreement. I'm sure they deep down believed it. But the problem was, they basically played a game of generational hot potatoes. They said, sure, there is a problem, but it's not my problem. Let's pass this problem on to the future generation, starting in the 70s, and the 80s, the 90s, and now in the year 2000, and so on. And this is the problem. This is a game of generational hot potatoes, and it's a game of musical chairs, and the music is slowly but surely starting to die down. So the question is, who's going to be the last one who's going to be left standing? And it looks like it's going to be this generation. And that is why I say the economy, where we're headed, is going to be quite catastrophic. I mean, it's I don't want to paint all doom and gloom, but it's not a pretty picture. And this is what is concerning, because hell is here and someone has to pay, and it looks like it's this generation. 30, 40, 50 years of economic negligence and spending irresponsibly. Someone has to answer for it. And because of the economic situation we're in and how the dynamics of power have changed after we went off the gold standard, you could be watching this video in Germany, India, France, or wherever. It doesn't matter. As I showed in the slide where America exports is inflation, or as Charles de Gaulle said, he knew that America has this exorbitant privilege, the basically deficits without tears. You might wonder and ask yourself, regardless of where you're from, is this the most influential person in America? This is the person who can solve all the problems? I say no. It's not the office of the president at this point, because there's so much money in the system, and it's no longer Joe Biden or whoever the president is who has the most influence in the world. It is rather this person, Jerome Powell. Not many people know him. Some people who pay attention to the news do, but this is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He controls basically all important economic metrics related to monetary policy, the supply of money, how much money the Federal Reserve is going to inject in the economy. And because, again, America is such a behemoth and it has so much influence on the rest of the world, you could be living in Germany. But because America, and this man specifically, Jerome Powell, is exporting inflation, he has a direct impact on your pay raise. He has a direct impact on the price of gas you pay every week. He has a direct impact on how much your mortgage is. This man is the most influential man in America, and frankly, I might argue the most influential man, or one of the most influential individuals in the entire world, because he has the keys to the kingdom that controls inflation, that controls the price of gasoline indirectly, and controls the supply of money. And all of that is spreading throughout the world because of America's channels of finance and all that. And you might be wondering, well, your spending powers is decreasing because of inflation. You might get a salary cut. Your mortgage payments is increasing. Your gasoline costs and spending costs is increasing, and it's all in the hands of one man. This shows the clown show we're in. One person should not have this much power. It's not if this is a good person or not. Power corrupts, and one person cannot, physically, I mean, he could be a genius, but still, he cannot account for all the factors involved within the behemoth that is the American economy. So this is the man right here. You're looking at him, staring him right in the eye, who's going to decide how much inflation you're going to face, how much money you have to spend at the grocery store, how much money you have to pay for gas, and how much your next monthly mortgage payment is going to be. Not Joe Biden, not the president, but this man. This is why more people, I wish, paid more attention to the Federal Reserve and considered it as a voting issue in the next election. Do not forget this man and do not forget his office. He has 100% direct impact and influence on how much money you spend and how much money you make. And again, the keys to the kingdom. He dictates also the returns on your portfolio. He can tank the stock market tomorrow and wipe out $1 trillion of wealth people have in their savings account, in their retirements, in their Roth IRAs. It doesn't matter. He is the biggest whale, basically. You might say, well, if Warren Buffett makes a move, he buys company XYZ, the market follows. He's a whale, sure, but Jerome Powell is the biggest whale of them all. What he buys, the market has to follow, whether they want to or not. He basically controls how many assets to purchase the Fed buys. He can decide tomorrow, let's turn on the money printer, print money, print money, print money, pump the market goes up. He can come tomorrow, one word in his speech, if he makes a speech tomorrow and say, well, the Federal Reserve is thinking about raising rates, the market could tank instantly. One word in his speech dictates how much retirement money you're going to have saved up tomorrow. This man is like a religious figure in some sense. Words that he says impact the world, impacts how much retirement money you have, how much your salary is, how much your raise is if it's tied to stock options. This is why the Federal Reserve is dangerous, and this is why it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but it's so important, and I hope you pay attention to this. This guy again. And going back, now that was a sideline just to show you the influence of the Fed, but let's just go back to America's reaction after 2015 when China pulled the rug and stopped buying, providing that line of credit. America had to react. They reacted too late. 2016, again, the national conversation around trade got more hawkish, sanctions, tariffs, and all that, although too late. It's too little, too late. And that's why, again, we see this hawkish reaction after China pulled the rug. And again, it's not a coincidence. So the inevitable question from America's perspective is now what? China's no longer funding the deficits, and the Federal Reserve begins to freak out because they had operated under this false assumption that they will be completely provided a line of credit by China to undergo, wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, military endeavors elsewhere, bail out corporations and all that. And now that line of credit, that one assumption, has been completely removed. So the Fed begins to freak out, and they only have one option left. If you're not getting money from outside, the only other option that you have, and the only organization that can do this is the Federal Reserve, is to print money. You invent money if you're not getting money. Isn't that nice? Well, they print money, and they themselves are the buyer of last resort. So they print money, they buy federal treasuries themselves, they buy mortgage-backed securities and all the sorts of assets, and by doing so, they pump the money and inject it into the economy. That in turn increases tax revenues, but it also increases inflation. And they've been doing this since 2015 at normal levels, whatever you want to call that. I mean, the whole thing is wrong, but they've been doing it at reasonable levels. And they had to do it because they had to keep the economy afloat. If China's not going to save the day, they have to do it themselves. They printed money and they injected it directly. Now, you let the printer go crazy, what can go wrong, right? Then this is what's happening because the Federal Reserve is always under pressure from politicians. Now, we saw this during the Trump presidency when Donald Trump wanted more money. He would go on Twitter and tell Jerome Powell to keep rates this way and do this, and it's created this whole situation where, in similar to, and this is the way you have to think about governments. If you're old enough, you at least get used to this. That's similar to Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and all that. When we face a tragedy, or we face a situation that involves an enemy or some sort of threat, we set aside our differences and we basically are lower expectations of individual rights and freedoms, in the sense that we give power to one man, one body, or one legislative authority for the sake of giving them control to figure out the situation, and we let it fly by. Now, you could say that what they did here was give too much influence to one man in the name of Jerome Powell, but I wouldn't say influence. They gave him direct power, and that is to basically control the keys of the economy and do all sorts of things. And that's why the Federal Reserve has become such a more prominent role after the dynamic relationship with China. And this is why I hope the public attention catches up to the influence that they have, specifically Jerome Powell. And we see that they're using the printing of money as an excuse, and they needed an excuse, right? Because I told you, China was providing around $1.4 trillion of trade surplus to America as a line of credit. And the Federal Reserve, once that line of credit got pulled out, had to print money. But they can't just print $1.4 trillion, right? They need an emergency, like I said in the last slide. They needed something to happen, and for them to have a justification to print and make up all the money that they have to print to make up the difference from what they were getting before with China and what they're getting now. And they really didn't have anything. They had no new wars. They had no new political unrest. And they basically needed an excuse for this Ponzi scheme, to borrow, to make money today, to give it tomorrow, to pay back current creditors, long-term creditors with current creditors' money. They basically needed an excuse, right? And what better excuse could they find? And they basically needed a reason. And the reason, or the crisis, came to them in no better form than it did on March of 2020, when Bill Ackman basically had his infamous interview on CNBC, and he said in regards to the pandemic that hell is coming. He's talked to his friends overseas in China and elsewhere, and he knows that this is a different sort of disease and it's going to completely shut down everything. And he said that hell is coming, and the market completely collapsed. I mean, this was a surprising collapse, one of the largest single-day collapses in history. Everyone panicked. And we see here that it's the worst drop in history, at least for the Dow Industrial, with 3,000 points in a single session. And it fell, I believe, close to like 30% in a matter of a few hours. And everyone panicked, and this is again going back to that crisis management mode where everyone said, okay, I just lost my entire portfolio. I'm going to give up my power and monetary expectations to one person and one person only, the Federal Reserve. Hopefully they can dig us out of this situation. And they did. They used this. They found the perfect excuse to print money, right? Because before they had to print money to make up the difference between what China was giving them and what they needed now, and they couldn't admit that. They couldn't say, well, everyone, we have to go through inflation. We have to print money because our politicians were irresponsible and we made a faulty assumption with China and we thought we're going to have a good deal with them. It didn't work out. We'll punish them, don't worry. But we got to print money. They were never going to admit that. So now they're using this as a smokescreen, this pandemic, and saying that they need to print all this money to basically get us out of this situation. And you know what? They might be right, because a pandemic is costly. You need money to come out of it and pump up the markets and lift people out. There's a lot of unemployment and everything and all that. But let me ask you this. I mean, you're a common sense individual. Ask yourself this. In response to COVID, the government printed $12 trillion just to respond to the disease and to the lockdowns. Now that you could say, well, what's 12 trillion? Let's not look at it in a vacuum. Let's compare it to all the wars that America has fought, including World War II, and all the wars that it's fought since then. So you have Vietnam, you have the Korean War, you have Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the wars combined. So you've got to ask yourself, is this situation that we're currently under as bad, or at least close to bad? I mean, 3 trillion is not much. That's the difference. 2 trillion, because it's basically 10 trillion. But is this situation that we faced in a year and a half ago worse than all these wars combined adjusted for inflation? Really? Do we need that much more money to fight off Germany, Saddam Hussein, the Taliban, Afghanistan, the Viet Cong? Do we need more money to fight this virus than all those enemies combined? A rational person would say no. And this is why you know they're using it as an excuse to go crazy. They're saying, well, we're in a crisis and we have to print money. But it's a disproportionate response. Like, it's such an overkill response. And they're only doing it not to respond to the situation, but to make up the difference for their faulty infrastructure and the financial infrastructure that they created based on that faultier assumption was China. And again, this graph literally broke. I couldn't even represent this with the graph because it literally goes out of scale. And you see the national debt, 4.5 trillion in 1 year. So our total debt is 26.5, but in 1 year they printed 4.5 trillion, and they're blowing smoke up everyone's kazoo. And this is the reason. They're saying it's because of what happened in 2020. But is it really that bad? Sure, it's bad, but is it $4.5 trillion bad? We spent less money on the wars that we fought previously. Is it as bad as those wars? I think not. Again, an overkill reaction to fix for mistakes they made in the past. And this, remember this graph that I showed you in the 2008 crisis? And I'm showing you this because when I showed you this graph, I'm sure you said, well, that's crazy. This little spike you see here is the response to the 2008 financial crisis. This is how much money they had to print to get the economy out of a recession. And you can say, wow, this is crazy. This is so much money. Well, guess what? Compare this to what they did in 2020. Remember that spike I just showed you in the last graph? That's that little speed bump over there. Why does it look so small? Because in 2020, they printed this much money to respond to the current economic recession. Isn't that crazy? What we thought was insane in 2008 is literally pocket change compared to what they're doing now. This is a graphical representation of how much money they printed. You don't have to have any understanding of economics. Heck, you don't even need to know what supply and demand is to know that this graph, something is wrong. This is an unhealthy indication of a failing economy that's headed for disaster. This spike right here makes this thing after 2008 compared look like it's basically we had 1 million 2008s in terms of proportional response of monetary policy in 2020. So ask yourself again, is this not overkill? And the answer is an obvious, astounding yes. And this is the S&P 500. I mean, well, this is when they print money, the market does well because they're printing money and they're taking that money and buying mortgage-backed securities, paying everyone checks every few months, and people are taking that money and putting it in the market. And this is one of the most common question I get asked in my emails is why is there such a disconnect between the economy and the stock market? And the answer to that is leverage, because it's such a joke. The stock market has turned into such a speculative joke because there's so much liquidity and so much money in the market that there's leverage. Leverage is basically borrowed money and excess money and all that. It multiplies your gain, but it also multiplies your losses. So leverage is basically pumping up the markets to crazy levels. Companies trading at 10x, 20x their revenue. And the only reason that's happening is because the Federal Reserve has printed so much money that everything is rising in prices. And that's why inflation first hits the stock market, and then we see it in the economy. So while the economy is doing absolutely terrible in terms of unemployment and labor force participation, the stock market's doing crazy well. I mean, if I showed you the stock market and I didn't show you any other economic metric of relating to the country's economy, and I showed you, hey, look, in 2021 we hit an all-time high on the S&P 500, you would think, wow, this country's doing really well. But then you'll take a closer look, you peel back the onion, and you see it's terrible. It's doing terrible. And that's why there's a disconnect. So there's not a disconnect because you don't understand it. There's a disconnect because the economy has turned into a joke because of how much money the Fed has printed. And again, 40% of all dollars in existence were printed in the last 12 months. And this is basically the warnings about hyperinflation that Jack Dorsey warned about, the people crowding out to Bitcoin and gold and all these things. And again, 40% of all dollars printed in the last quarter is a response to the pandemic. Isn't that overkill? Do we need that much money to fight this damn pandemic? I think not. Again, why are they doing it? Because they have to make up the difference between what China was giving them in 2015 and what they have to have now to sustain the same level of irresponsible spending. So this is an overkill reaction. And again, look at this. Spending more money. I want you to remember this picture next time you go to the ballot box when you think about mismanagement of money. Save this picture. Now, let's take a step back, because I know we looked very deeply into the American trajectory from a macro perspective, but let's take a step back and look at geopolitics. Where is America headed today? This is the American trajectory. I'm going to compare this with the Chinese trajectory. So America has been spending and going to war every few years. I mean, but forget the years before World War II. America has a cyclical economy that goes into recession every year, and I think it's not a coincidence that they also go to war every few years after a recession. I mean, the first dollar gold crisis came in October of 1960. Let's look at after Bretton Woods and between leaving the gold standard. So that's why I said let's look at after World War II. The price of gold shot up to, I think, around $40. And as a result, the United States established a London gold pool. So the first early warnings we saw of the gold standard failing was because of the Vietnam War picking up in the 60s. And they had to create the gold pool because they want to print money, and there was tensions with liquidity, especially in Europe. And the gold reserves were being depleted. They were running out of gold stock. So they created the London gold pool to kind of put bandages over the problem, because their spending was so reckless in all these wars that they had to come up with an alternative. They couldn't go off the gold standard in 1960. They went off it in 71, but they put this temporary solution. And this, again, Eisenhower warned us in his farewell address about the military-industrial complex. Now, what is the military-industrial complex? Sure, it's a collection of military companies. Well, let's take a closer look at how it impacts the economy. So the military-industrial complex is I guess, the unfortunate and deadly marriage between wars and economic growth. We had Vietnam, and for the purposes of Vietnam, think about it as multiple wars, because they keep sending troops and they first started with advisors under Kennedy, then Johnson came in and there was a surge, then Nixon went crazy, and so on and so forth. But we basically think of Vietnam as basically multiple wars for the purposes of this slide. And again, in Iraq, we had surges. In Afghanistan, we had a surge after 2019. There was no major new wars, but we sent troops, so it was kind of like a new war where we had to enlist people. And what happens in a war is everyone gets a job. Wars are good for the economy. Manufacturers make money. Soldiers, everyone who's unemployed becomes a soldier and gets money, and the economy grows. And isn't it a coincidence that every time America goes into a recession, look at the recession timeline. I put the recession timeline of every time America's gone into a recession and highlighted every time they've gone into a war. In 48, they went into a recession, right? But forget this. Let's start with here. 1960, the Cold War, right? They go into a recession, 1, 2, 3. That's the Vietnam War. Every time they went into a recession, they kind of ramped up troop deployments to Vietnam. In the 50s, they went into a recession. We went to the Korean War, right? And here again, we see that in July of 1980 to 1982, they went into a recession. We saw what they did in Latin America with all the spending they did with weapons and Contra and all that. And again, in the 90s, there was a recession, and we had a war in Kuwait. And then again, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we went into a recession. What did we do as a response? We went to war again. 2009 again, we didn't have any new wars, but a response to this recession was a surge. So to lift the economy out of a recession, you can either print money or go find a new war where you hire everyone and inject money into the economy that way. So this is the scary marriage between economy and the military-industrial complex. And it's something that's not often talked about. They talk about the military-industrial complex, but they do so in a vacuum. But when you line up the history of the wars this country has been to, combined with the recessions they've been to, a very interesting pattern emerges that if you want to predict when is the next time they're going to go to a big war, we'll ask when is the next time they're going to go into a recession. Now, that's the American trajectory, wars and irresponsible spending. Let's look at the Chinese trajectory. So China is, again, the trade surplus if it's not flowing into the Fed, right? So China said, why are we spending all this money to America? Why not withhold that money and spend it where we want to spend it to fulfill our own geopolitical initiatives and strategies? And again, they view America as the new kid on the block. This is, anytime you deal with an ancient country that has thousands upon thousands of years of history, they do not respect countries that are younger than them. This is actually a common topic discussed in geopolitics, but they basically don't consider America their equivalent, and that's why there's so much conflict, despite the fact that they have sometimes economic interest aligning. So they withhold that money, and guess what they did? Something called the Belt and Road Initiative. Instead of sending that $1.4 trillion trade surplus, China said, well, let's build up our military, let's build up our trade infrastructure around the world, and let's start building our network of trade and network of financial organs all over the world, especially in developing parts of the world like Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. And China has been playing the long game. This is what they're doing. They take their money back and they build everything they need to think about the next century. How are they going to be the world superpower in the next 100 years to come? They're not thinking about wars. They're not thinking about corporate bailouts. They're thinking about how they can slowly but surely take over the world. And this is the Belt and Road Initiative. Basically, they're trying to connect and make dependent the entire world on China. So they're building trade organs from Xi'an to Tehran to Moscow and to Rotterdam. This is the Silk Road economic belt. And what they're doing is very interesting. They go to countries like Pakistan who are in debt, and they're saying, well, listen, Pakistan, well, we have money. We just had this agreement with America until 2015 where we were going to send our trade surplus to them. But guess what? We're deciding we're not going to send our trade surplus, and we're going to withhold that cash. And we can give a percentage of that cash to you so you come out of debt. But in return, you have to give me a military port, a naval port in this strategic part of the world, or even in Iran close to the Strait of Hormuz where 30 to 40% of all the world's oil passes. And you have to give us a lease for 100 years. So we'll bail your country out, but you give us that port and you give us the land rights to it for 100 years. And they did, because a lot of these countries are ruled by dictators and despots who couldn't care less about their countries and are signing over the rights of the country because they're filling their own coffers and pockets. And again, goes back to the wolf warrior diplomacy, where Xi Jinping, this ethnic nationalist who is talking about basically expanding China and one China, trying to unify all of China and expand its borders. That's why every country that has a border with China has problems with China. India, Tibet, Mongolia, even through international waters with the Philippines and Vietnam and fishing and all that. There's huge problems with China because of this wolf warrior diplomacy. After 2015, they got emboldened. They're not bowing down to America. They're not providing a line of credit. They're fulfilling their own coffers. They're fulfilling their own interests, and frankly, you can't blame them. And we saw in 2014, this is something, I mean, you could say it's a prediction or what it is, but they're trying to make a move on Taiwan. If you're paying any attention to the news lately, there's a lot of tension between the United States and China over Taiwan. China's saying that Taiwan belongs to them, and America says Taiwan is an independent country. And we saw a similar thing happen with Russia and Crimea, where they said that Ukraine, that part of Crimea, is a strategic port, belongs to us. And Russia made their move right after the Winter Olympics in Sochi because they got all this good international reputation and PR, and then they made their move on occupying Crimea. So maybe, and this is a side projection, we could see China making a similar move on Taiwan militarily after the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. They'll show off to the world who they are. We saw this happening with Germany and before World War II. They host this big festival showing off to the world how powerful and great they are. And after they get all the good PR, then they'll make their move. They get emboldened after these sorts of Olympics. So let's see what happens to Taiwan after the 2022 Winter Olympics. And we see, again, going back to China thinking long term, right after America pulled out and this group, who I can't say their name because this video might get demonetized, took over Afghanistan, and guess what they said? The first one that's their ally is China. And why is Afghanistan important to China? Because Afghanistan has $1 trillion worth of precious metals and rare earth minerals, which are vital for industrial purposes, for technological purposes, for semiconductors, for computer chips, for all sorts of things. And when America loses, China is right there waiting to pick up the pieces and make a move to their own benefit. This is why they're thinking long term. And now, because they went off the gold standard in 1971, America in the meantime has been busy trying to find ways to prop up the dollar after going on the fiat system, which is away from the gold standard. So the question here is, how do you give legitimacy to your currency if your currency is no longer backed by an asset like gold. At least because before you could say, well, it has legitimacy because it's backed by gold. I mean, sure, you can say it's backed by the world's most powerful military and economy, but I'm talking about something more substantive, like a backing of an asset. So America has a de facto backing of their dollar, and that's in oil. They have this agreement with Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia gets to sell their oil as the largest oil producer, but they have to do so in US dollars. And before, it was enforced by the London Gold Pool and the General Agreed Upon Agreements of Trade and Tariffs. That should be GATT, I believe, and it's now enforced by a war and military. So we see, how do they enforce this? Well, before it used to be through diplomacy, and now if you do not trade your oil in USDs and try to undermine the legitimacy of the US dollar under this fiat regime, you're going to have some run-ins with the US military. And this is not some crazy conspiracy. I'm actually far from it, but this is an observation. Let me show you. So Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, went off the dollar standard for their oil. They basically said, we're not going to sell our oil in USDs, we'll take it in euros. And that kind of undermined the legitimacy of the US dollar because they no longer were being backed by gold, they were being backed by oil. And Iraq was a large oil producer, and they said, we're going to dump the dollar for the euro. 2003. I guess what happened in the same year? He got executed 3 years later. Syria. They also picked euros over dollars. Syria has switched all of the state's foreign currency transactions to euros from dollars amid a political confrontation with the United States. 2006. I guess what happened to them 6 years later in the Arab Spring. US dollar no longer a quote currency in Venezuela, 2018. Guess what happened to Venezuela? Also had a run-in with the US military. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya tried to implement the gold for oil plan. Basically, he wanted to dump gold, US dollars, and trade oil and gold for African countries, and kind of wanted to create his own gold dinar currency. And again, I have to preface this. This is not some convenient conspiracy, because one could reasonably say, well, there's a correlation between these countries not trading USDs and not wanting to have USDs backing their gold, and correlation doesn't simply imply causation. That could be true, right? You could say, well, you're kind of stretching the fact here. Well, here, I'll say this to you. Don't take it from me. Take it from the horse's mouth. I'm not the one making this claim. A U.S. general made it. 5-star. Look at this. Wesley Clark, and this is this video that some of you might have not seen. It's his famous video of 7 countries in 5 years, and you could say, well, it's a coincidence that you're saying all these things are connected. But here, watch this video. This is Wesley Clark, and his video basically is showing how the United States had this plan of going to 7 countries in 5 years.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, we're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk and picked up a piece of paper. He said, "I just got this down from upstairs from the Secretary of Defense's office today." And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
And there you have it. That this is, again, it's not a convenient conspiracy, straight from the horse's mouth about what the true intention and what the geopolitical implications of having a petrodollar is.
About 10.
And again, going back to the trajectory of that I discussed in China and America, we see that we're arriving at some sort of crossroads. We've seen in the centuries past with France and the British, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the Russians, the Japanese, I mean, the list goes on. Whenever a rising power is about to displace a dominant power, there's always, always, always been geopolitical and economic tensions, oftentimes a war. But that's changed after the invention of nuclear weapons because it's mutually assured destruction, so they resort to cold wars or economic warfare. And here we see that the same thing is happening with China and America. America is desperate for a new massive trading partner who can subsidize their deficit. I mean, they basically turned over all the rocks. They've depleted Japan, they've depleted Europe, they've depleted China until 2015. So they're looking for some massive untapped market where they can dump all their trade there, and they in return do what China was doing, which is take their surplus trade and buy treasury bills and basically subsidize America's spending. And maybe, you never know, maybe that's why they're so desperate to have an agreement with Iran, because Iran's $1 trillion untapped economy. Maybe that's one of the reasons, who knows. But America's desperate right now, and this is the prediction that people are having, that America has to basically debase their currency as the world reserve, and that's one of the other ways they can come out of this. But that has huge ramifications for geopolitics. America's going to lose a very coveted spot by doing so. And this is again the Triffin dilemma that says that a country cannot also have as a world reserve currency at the same time as they have and be sustainable in the long term, because the demands of their domestic country's economy, while at the same time fulfilling the requirements of being the world reserve on the international market, are oftentimes incompatible. And this is good for Bitcoin, this is good for gold, because it kind of proves that there is an alternative to a stable currency that is a store of wealth in the face of unmitigated inflation as we're seeing right now. You also have to remember it's not just in the face of unmitigated inflation, but it is also in the face of unmitigated geopolitical tensions, or the possibility of such tensions. This right here in geopolitics is referred to as the Thucydides trap, where historically every time a rising power has established a hegemony of an established power, you have had war, or some variations of it. I mean, in the Cold War, it wasn't a direct war, hence the name, but there nevertheless were proxy wars in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. And there was war in a different sense. But every time you have a rising power like the Habsburgs or the Ottoman empires, or Japan in face of Russia, or where Japan became the first Asian country to defeat a European country in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, we see this history repeating time and time and again, and there's no indication that it won't repeat. So there appears to be that in addition to that unmitigated inflation, you're going to have a lot of geopolitical tensions between a rising power that is China threatening the hegemony of America. And the consideration to pay attention to this time around is that America, as the established power, also has a lot of internal problems. Financially speaking, they have the biggest problem, I would say, is the balance of payment problems, which leads to the massive facilitation of taking debt. And that balance of payment problem is going to be an interesting factor to see how an established power is going to handle a rising power, a very rapidly rising power, in face of that balance of payment problems. And this is a personification of that problem. This is showing you the problem. I mean, forget all these numbers. I've circled and highlighted the potential areas of problem. Over here, you see what the tax revenue is. So every year, America is taking in this much money, $3 trillion from tax, and they're spending this much, right? I mean, this is just basic math. If they're bringing in $3 trillion and they're spending $6 trillion, they're going to be $3 trillion in the hole. This is the deficit they have to fulfill. This is the problem. Before, they used to have help from China. China used to cover this, but now they don't have China, so they have to print money, and they can't sustain their wars. Maybe that's why they ended Afghanistan. They say, well, it's time to bring home the troops. They could have brought home the troops anytime, but they probably only brought them now because they know that it's unsustainable. It's a bankrupt nation. And Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires. The Russians learned the hard way, the British did, and now America. So this is the problem, this $3 trillion problem, and this is the deficit that America is facing and have to fill in the hole somehow without China. And again, going back to the COVID problem, when Adam Smith talks about, one of my favorite parts of his book is that there is no art which the government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from the pockets of the people. And that is very true. We hear news about unrealized gains. Janet Yellen's talking about taxing unrealized gains. Basically, it's some preposterous proposition about how if your portfolio, you haven't sold the stock and it goes up $100, you haven't yet sold it, you have to pay taxes on that, even if you haven't sold it. Imagine if you applied that ridiculous idea to your home. If your home, you have $1 million home, you bought it 10 years ago and now it's worth $2 million. You have to pay taxes on that $1 million, which is ridiculous. Even though you haven't sold your home and you're still living in it, you have to pay taxes. And Adam Smith saw this 3 centuries ago. And another favorite quote of mine from Thomas Jefferson is that he believes that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, does that ring a bell? Then by deflation, the banks and corporations will grow up around the banks that will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. And this bank, although he couldn't have foresaw the Federal Reserve, is directly going into the Federal Reserve. And our founding fathers warned of this very same thing we're seeing of inflation, this amazing foresight they had in 1802. And yet, despite this foresight, despite this warning, and despite this canary in the coal mine, the same thing as that he warned about has unfortunately happened. And this is why I'm talking about crisis mode in the economy. And the $3 trillion that's causing all this inflation of this printing of money, they're basically devaluing everyone's purchasing power. If you don't get a pay raise, and let's say you're making $50K a year and you don't get a pay raise and inflation is 10%, you basically got a 10% pay cut. Because with that same amount of money, you are buying less. Your purchasing power has been diminished. This is why they say that history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And we can actually look at another historical example. So here, this is the gross total public debt as a percentage of domestic product. So this is because some people often criticize my past video of showing how I can't show debt in a vacuum. I have to show it in relation to GDP. And this is the video, this is the chart that basically shows you how bad. This is 120, this is how much leverage their economy is. So if our economy could sustain 100%, it will be fine. But we're 25% over what our economy can sustain in terms of debt, and that's not good. This is a point of no return historically. No country has went past this point, Japan or other countries, and been able to recover in terms of debt. If your debt gets out of hand, it's a point of no return. This is why I say it's crisis mode. This is the formula, total debt of a country in relation to their GDP. And I mean, if you want to think about it as an individual, think about how much your assets are worth and how much your liabilities are worth. If your liabilities are worth more than your assets, you're in trouble. You owe someone money. And America is in trouble. 125% debt to GDP ratio. And people often forget, again, inflation, it's not always a bad thing. I mean, sure, it's bad for the average Joes, but it helps borrowers and it hurts lenders. What do I mean by that? Because if you're borrowing money, right, if I give you $100 and I tell you to pay me back in a year $110 because that's the interest rate, it actually is hurting me, because if inflation is 20% and I'm asking you to only pay me back 10% of that money, then I've kind of lost that money. I'm not getting back the same money I gave you. So you as a lender I as a lender am getting hurt, because you as a borrower have to pay back less money in real terms than what you actually borrowed. You borrowed $100, but in real terms you're paying back less, say $90. So I'm the one getting the short end of the stick. And this is exactly why the Federal Reserve has no other option than to let inflation run hot. Because what happens with inflation? Well, it helps borrowers and hurt lenders. America is a borrower. If they let inflation run hot, they have to pay back less in real terms. They're servicing their own debt. They're paying back less in real terms than nominal terms. And inflation in the short term, increases tax proceeds. So what does that mean? Well, it means that companies are going to overstate their revenues because they have to increase prices, and they pay more taxes as a percentage. And I'll show you an example. So this is a great real-life example from Coca-Cola. And you'll notice the date here, April 19, 2021. And when we have inflation, what happens is that the input prices and the input costs for a lot of these companies, small and large, increases. So in the short term, what they do is raise prices. Now look at this. Coca-Cola CEO says company will raise prices to offset higher commodity prices. Ask yourself this. What happens in the short term when a company raises their prices relative to their cost? Their costs haven't yet increased at this point. They're doing it in anticipation of news and headlines by April 19th that inflation is coming. And we saw that in the summer of that same year, in this past summer, inflation did in fact go on a rapid rise. But this was in the quarter that they increased it. We'll see. Well, guess what happens when they raise prices? Their revenues increase. Surprise, surprise. So by July 21, when they released their earnings report, they increased their revenues by $1 billion. Now, ask yourself this. Did they really sell $1 billion more, or assuming it's $1 per bottle, but let's say, keep it simple, $1 a bottle. Did they really sell that much more Coca-Cola in that quarter? Not really. I mean, it's not like Coca-Cola invented a new product and became all of a sudden very popular, and the shutting down of restaurants also wasn't helping it. So it wasn't because demand for Coca-Cola increased. And even if it did, as we get, into the warmer weather, it wasn't this much increase. This rise in expected revenue, and the reason why the estimates and the earnings estimate was a beat and it surprised everyone, is because of inflation. It's not because they had this massive re-strategy and management phenomenon where they increased sales by that much just solely on demand. My understanding of my estimate of based on my understanding of economics is that this was because of inflation. When they raise prices in the short term, their revenues increase. And here's a perfect example. So, just a quick summary. Inflation. What does it do? If you don't understand economics, memorize this slide and you'll know everything you have to know about inflation. It helps borrowers and it hurts lenders. How does it help borrowers? Well, if you're borrowing money today and you have to pay it back tomorrow, and I'm using tomorrow in a metaphorical sense. Let's say you're paying it back in a year, and there's rampant inflation going on between the point you're borrowing it today and the point you're paying back the money. So if you borrow $100 today at 10% interest rates and you're supposed to pay back that money in a year, and let's say inflation's at 15 or even 20%, the money you're paying back in real terms is less. So you're paying back $110, but that $110 from in a year from now with 15% inflation is not going to have the same purchasing power that it does today. That is why it helps borrowers and it hurts lenders. That's why we saw that article with Wells Fargo cutting their credit services and limiting the number of loans they're giving out. It's not because they're going bankrupt. That was the headline and everyone started to panic. That was a false misrepresentation and a misunderstanding for people who don't understand economics. It wasn't because they had money problems. It's simply because the inflationary environment that is out there is not favorable for a bank to come out and start lending money. So they cut that part of their business out because in real terms, it wasn't profitable. And this, again, going on a macro picture, is exactly why the Federal Reserve, the biggest borrower of all, has to let inflation run hot. The only difference between you borrowing money for a mortgage or a car payment and the Federal Reserve is you have to pay that money back, and so does the Federal Reserve. But unlike you, the Federal Reserve has the power to control inflation. They are in this funny situation where they can borrow money but also print money to pay it back. So what do? Well, they print money, create inflation, so the money they have to pay back tomorrow for all the crap they borrowed today is less in real terms. So you allow inflation to run hot to service your own debt. And again, that's because you're paying back less in real terms versus nominal terms. This is very basic. And inflation, again, we saw with the Coca-Cola example, increases tax proceeds in the short term, right? Because Coca-Cola raised their prices. In the short term, what happens? They have $1 billion in excess revenue. Guess what? Uncle Sam's going to take a portion of that. That too will help the Federal Reserve pay down their debt. But look at this. The Federal Reserve, because of their own incompetence of borrowing so much money, has to let inflation run hot so they can service their own debt. But you, the people, are the collateral damage of this inflation. Your savings account is going to be diminished. Your paycheck is going to be diminished. If you have money sitting under the sofa or in the bank, it's going to be diminished. Remember, if inflation's at 10% and your salary doesn't increase this year by a bonus, that means in real terms you have taken a 10% salary cut, a pay cut, and that's only because of Jerome Powell. Hence why I said he's the most influential person that no one seems to talk about. We talk about division of power, but I guess it doesn't apply when it comes to the Federal Reserve. This is a graph of the German Republic. This is the Weimar Republic prior to, after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, where their economy was put in a situation where they had to take on massive amounts of debt and also print a lot of money. They owned, obviously, war reparations to France and to the UK and all these countries, the signatories of the Treaty of Versailles. They couldn't pay that debt, so they printed money. And this is the CPI, basically the rate of inflation in Germany following the end of World War I, right around here, to 1924. Does this graph look similar? I mean, it's not as extreme here or in North America, but it's getting there. So we'll see how it goes. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So let's take a closer look at something else. So Germany debt to GDP ratio. So the last graph I showed you was the inflation. Now let's look at their debt. They obviously had a huge increase in debt after World War II. But look at this. Their debt went down. But we saw in the previous graph that their inflation was terrible. So when you look at this graph in a vacuum, you think, well, surprise, surprise, their economy must have picked up between 1915 and 1920 when they had all that debt. Well, not necessarily so, because you have to remember, this is when the debt kicked in. So their debt to GDP ratio and their GDP crash went bonkers. Now, an industrious country that came out of a massive war and had their economy poorly managed by self-interested leaders who let inflation get out of hand. Does that sound familiar to you? That's exactly what happened here. So their debt to GDP ratio, basically debt over GDP, a basic fraction, went up and came down. But it didn't come down because their GDP all of a sudden recovered. It came down because they increased the rate of inflation. So relatively speaking, they serviced their own debt by letting inflation run hot. They made that debt worthless in real terms because there was so much money. There are famous pictures. I recommend you look this up on Google. Look at people buying bread in the Weimar Republic. They literally had to bring wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. That's how bad inflation was. And that was their only way out to let their debt be serviced. They had to let inflation run hot. And that's exactly what's happening today in the United States of America. Now put these two graphs together, another interesting relationship forms. I mean, I described it in the last slide, but look at this. Inflation goes up, their debt goes down. It's not because their economy is doing well, but it's because they're letting inflation run hot, and as a result, again, their debt goes down relative to GDP. This is the graph today. Looks similar. Look at this part over here, the 2020 graph after the outbreaks and the lockdown. This graph, this is similar to the Weimar Republic. This graph goes up exponentially crazy, and it slowly starts to come down. But it's not because the Fed has started to taper in terms of their asset purchases or reduce their debt, but it's because they printed money and let inflation run hot. So relatively, it's coming down, but it still has a long, long way to go. And you see over here, again, going back to the beginning of this video, right after the gold standard, things seemed normal, and then it went bonkers. Because when you don't have a gold standard to keep you disciplined, federal bankers go crazy. So let's look at future. I mean, this video is about looking ahead and why I think the economy is doomed, at least in the coming years. We might have a crash when we recover, which I'm optimistic about the recovery, but we'll see. That's a video for another day. This video is focused on the crash and why I'm using economic terms, basic financial terms that anyone can understand to explain to you why we are in trouble in the sense of people who are managing our economy, or rather mismanaging it. So today, It's November, but I'm starting from September 2021. Let's start at the beginning of that month. The prediction even then, I mean, you don't have to look at November. This says September. It was true since the days they started printing in March of 2020. The United States dollar, easy prediction will be that the only way out of this is to debase it as the world's reserve currency in the coming years and decades, because that's the only way out you have of this, right? You can't, I mean, sure, you saw in the last graph they're using inflation to pay down the debt, but it's really just going to put a slight dent. There's a bigger picture at play here. You're not going to pay down 50 years worth of debt and irresponsible mismanagement by just letting inflation run hot. It's like taking Advil when you have a brain tumor. It might help with a short-term headache, but your problem is not going to go away. And the only way out of it is by debasing the U.S. currency. And that has a whole slew of geopolitical, economic, foreign policy implications that I could discuss in another video, but it's just not looking good. And in the short term, when we have inflation, well, what does inflation do? Well, it's good for asset owners, anyone who owns assets, be it crypto, be it stocks, homes, cars, anything. When you have assets, even a piece of lumber, you are benefiting from it because the price of that asset is artificially being pumped up by irresponsible federal bankers. May God help you if you don't own assets. That's why before the crash that's coming, it's very easy to we're going to have a bull market. It could go on for a year or more, but it's going to be a bull market. If you have assets, they're going to go up in value. If you have stocks, they're going to go up in value. Not in real terms, but on a piece of paper, they're going to be worth more. And that's the consequence. We saw that in the German Republic. We see it in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a phenomenal stock market, even though they have the worst inflation, but it's precisely because of the inflation. So if you want to take advantage of the inflation, own assets. Own assets and even borrow money, but don't lend money or don't be someone who doesn't own assets, which unfortunately is where we're headed. The powers that be don't like when people own assets, which I will show you in a slide that's coming up. So make sure you own assets and make sure you don't lose control of those assets in this period where we have this rapid rise in asset prices before a big crash, when the bubble bursts. So this goes to my next slide, which I was talking about how the powers that be don't like you to own assets. And this is an article that I recommend you to read. It's from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I've been following this trend recently, but this article really summarizes the activities of big banks, hedge funds, and corporations, even with Zillow. I mean, they got screwed over in their home purchase and they had to cut back, but that's just a small player in a big pond filled with much bigger fish, like BlackRock, which is buying up houses using algorithms and using faceless corporations to basically outbid consumers, normal average people like you and I, by bidding 20% over asking on a house in the suburbs, just so they can corner the market and take rapid ownership. And when they do is they buy all the houses in the neighborhood and they rent it out, and they basically make an investment vehicle out of that for their shareholders. They're not concerned about you. They're concerned about their next quarterly annual shareholder meeting. So they're buying up these houses and they're paying 20% over asking price. And that's why the housing market's going crazy. We don't have a lot of inventory in terms of number of available houses because as soon as they hit the market, they're getting bought up. And you don't need an article to tell you. I mean, I get emails from you saying you see it every day in your own neighborhood, from Arizona to California to Texas to South Carolina, even in Canada and elsewhere. We see this happening. Corporations buying homes above asking prices just to outbid everyday average Joe consumers, because they don't want people to own assets. Corporations should own it, right? And when tenants won't pay or leave, small landlords face. And this is not just bad for tenants, it's also bad for small landlords, because they're stuck with tenants because of the lockdowns and because of unemployment. They can't pay. So corporations are the bigger winners, both from the buy side and also the sell side. So it's really crowding out the market and making sure that all the consumer surplus that is created in this transaction of a sale of a home is wholly and solely collected and captured by corporations only, because they don't want you to own assets. This is the great reset that the economic forums are talking about. This is the future we're headed. mass inflation where the only people who own assets benefit, and soon the only people who will own assets are big corporations on Wall Street. And it's not just homes. We see this with Amazon. Amazon's doing this thing where they don't even want you to own a hammer or a screwdriver or any everyday household product. Because what they're going to do is in the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to go on Amazon and basically you're going to rent a product for a day. You're going to rent a microwave. You're going to rent an air fryer. You're going to rent a hair dryer even, or a hammer or a repair kit or anything, a makeup kit. Nothing, something like that for a day, and they're going to have drones going, for example, to Home Depot or Lowe's or Marshall's, picking up the package and delivering it to your front yard or backyard so you can use it, so you don't even have to own. I mean, they're disguising this as with the veil of convenience, but it's a dangerous ruse and bait to trick people into not owning assets, because everything's going to be done by these big corporations and AI and drones and everything. You're going to have all those tools and great everyday household products delivered right to the door of a home which you don't own but rent and pay rent to BlackRock. This is the future. This is the Great Reset. And this, I guess, is how these corporations will capitalize on the big crash that will soon happen. And the only way I see out of it is, I mean, a really good step for the central bank is to have a digitally backed asset. I mean, the days of gold being world reserve is archaic and over. Using the gold as a standard to basically back up a currency is over, but they could have a public, fully verifiable ledger, and they could buy Bitcoin. I mean, it's not a crazy idea. The central banks could go out and buy a Bitcoin. Now, some people have sent me papers and academic research papers saying that they want the Fed to create their own digitally backed asset. But my caution to you is that that is a privacy nightmare. Sure, it sounds good on paper that we keep them in check, but the reason I said they should go something like a Bitcoin, and some might say it's unfeasible, and there are valid points to that, why a central bank can't buy Bitcoin as they did, for example, to replace the gold standard. That's fine. But there are a lot of people saying that the Federal Reserve should create their own digital backed currency to basically peg the US dollar to its own, do excessive printing. I caution against that, because we see what happens in China. That's why China is trying to get rid of Bitcoin. They're shutting down miners. They're kicking out all these cryptocurrency operations out of their country, because they want to have their own national currency so they can track every single nickel and dime you spend at wherever. So if you're donating it to the wrong political party or to the wrong journalist, they will come after you. And that's the same privacy nightmare that I'm talking about here. Every withdrawal, every deposit, every transfer, every spending will be tracked to you second by second, penny by penny. So this is my caution to those. Yes, I get it. It's an exciting piece of technology. All this digitally backed ledgers and all digitally backed assets with a fully verifiable ledger. It's all cool, but I don't see a feasible way at this point. Maybe in the future there's a way where it can have some oversight and some ways to keep the government in check. But at the current time, this is just a slide just to respond to those emails that are enthusiastic about it. And here I say it's best to err on the side of caution. So here's what I'm doing. I got this question as well about what I'm doing. So again, in the short term, we're going to have more inflation. Jerome Powell and Joe Biden or whoever's in charge can say it's transitory, which means it's short term, it's going to go away. That's nonsense. Inflation is here to stay. It's not going away anytime soon. You can't print that much money and expect inflation to go away in 2 or 3 months or even 2 years. So what I'm doing is I'm stocking up on all sorts of assets. Bitcoin, for example, it's been the highest returning asset in the world in the past 5 years, if not more. And that's what I'm stocking up. I've been stocking up since many years now, 2013 and onwards, but I'm just adding to my position and holding. It's a better hedge against inflation than is gold. I'm buying stocks and I'm investing in real estate, because in the short term, you saw that graph with the Weimar Republic. There was a rapid rise in inflation before it crashed, before the catastrophic crash, because you have to take advantage of this inflation. Sure, it's all a fugazi clown game, but take advantage of it. If inflation is going to run hot, you don't want to be on the short end of the stick not owning any assets. So make sure you own assets. That's what I'm doing, at least. It's not any financial advice I'm giving. I'm simply stating what I'm doing. And this again is a reminder of what's going to happen to the stock market. This is the stock market in Germany. You see over here, they had inflation. Look at their stock market's performance. And you see that even in nominal terms, it went up. Not in real terms, but in nominal terms. That's why I said it's a clown world, because in real terms, it's worthless. But in nominal terms, it went up. And when someone asks you why is there a disconnect between the current economy with rapid unemployment, rapid lack of people not wanting jobs, and just low economic productivity and labor participation while the stock market's booming? Well, because we live in a clown world with inflation. This graph is in Germany. Again, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. When Germany went into debt and they had to print their way out of it, their stock market rallied, and that's exactly what we're seeing today. It's not because our economy is doing great, it's because we have inflation. So everything that has a price and dollar figure to it goes up. So just take advantage of it before the big crash. That's what I'm doing. This graph here again. I'm showing this a lot of times, but it's just so important. This is Germany again. Their inflation and their stock market. You see that? It's not a coincidence. Same thing happening here. And going back to Bitcoin, this is why, I mean, the stock market, sure, it will go up and up and up. It will rally and rally until it crashes. But Bitcoin, for me, I really like it because it's transparent. It's faceless. I mean, some people say they don't know who Satoshi is. I've heard various theories that it's Adam Back, the British researcher, or whoever. But even if it is him, he has plausible deniability. So governments can't just come after him and arrest him and pressure him to sell his position or whatever. But it's fair, it's transparent, and it's predictable. Now, I say predictable with an asterisk because, you know, a lot of people say it's a bubble and a lot of criticisms. And you know what? We're in everything right now is a bubble, okay? It's not just, sure, Bitcoin is a bubble, but unlike other types of bubbles, like the tulip bubble, whenever it crashes, it recovers. And that's what makes a difference between a bubble and another bubble, is when it crashes, it recovers. So Bitcoin has proof of concept for the 10 plus years. It has crashed, sure, and it has been at points bubbles, speculatory bubbles. People have crowded into it and it's crashed. But it has been the single best performing asset in terms of return in the past decade. I mean, in the stock market, I believe the #1 performing stock has been Shopify. But the stock market, if you're skeptical about it, this is why I like Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation. It's not that Bitcoin is this phenomenal great idea. It wouldn't even be this popular if it wasn't for irresponsible and this gross negligence towards our economy by central bankers. If the central bankers ran the economy the way they were supposed to, no one would give two hoots about Bitcoin. The reason why Bitcoin is even slightly relevant is because it's the only hedge against the current clown economy. It's the only way to protect your money and to protect your assets. And that's why even the big banks, who were so dismissive of Bitcoin, are slowly but surely realizing this. Goldman Sachs, all these hedge funds, they said that Bitcoin was this ruse and was this sham, and back then there was no proof of concept, so they had some reason to be suspicious. But now they're realizing that holding cash, holding USDs in face of 20% inflation is a bigger risk. So they're just lowering the risk. Sure, Bitcoin is risky, but compared to the clown world we live in, it's less crazy. It's less risky. So that's why. If you want to ask who made Bitcoin popular, it's not the average Joe. It's because the central bankers made it popular inadvertently by mismanaging this economy. The people can take so much before they resort to things like this. And this goes back to the Triffin dilemma, the economic principle I discussed way back in this PowerPoint presentation, which was that your world reserve currency could not be fed adequately by gold production. So yes, the gold standard, I know in the beginning of the video I talked about Bretton Woods and what a great system it was, and it was for the time it was running. And sure, Nixon might have prematurely exited it because of the Vietnam War, but a lot of comments I see on the videos I had before they got deleted was that we should come back to a Bretton Woods system. And sure, I mean, there's some arguments to be made, but the Bretton Woods system long-term was not viable because the Triffin dilemma. So it might have, if Nixon hadn't exited, it might have ran into another 10 years, but eventually it would have had to be replaced simply by the flaws inherent in its design, which was the Triffin dilemma, which says that at the same time that you have a world reserve currency that basically satisfies and quenches the thirsts of world trade organs, you can't do that at the same time of fulfilling your domestic needs for your own people. So the US dollar cannot be used domestically for everyday transactions for American people, while at the same time satisfying the current accounts and balance of accounts of the entire rest of the world wanting to trade. And that's the Triffin dilemma, that you have to kind of do this balancing act, and sure, it might work for some time as it did with Bretton Woods, but eventually the house of cards is going to collapse. And there's been, there's no perfect, easy solution to this. There's been there are various research papers in economics about creating a world currency that the IMF manages, which I don't like either. But the fact of the matter is there's no easy answer. However, the gross negligence that central bankers have shown towards our economy is not acceptable despite this fact. And despite the fact that there was some marvelous secrets of deficit without tears, the gross negligence and the monopoly of power that the central bank, specifically Jerome Powell, has is unacceptable, regardless of the fact that other alternatives might not be perfect. What's happening right now is so unacceptable that even the worst option compared to this is the best option. Going back to Bitcoin, I put that slide there because it was just a response to a few comments I saw previously in my previous channel before it was removed. Going back to Bitcoin, a common objection to Bitcoin that it's archaic, old, and outdated technology. And that's, all true. You look at Ethereum with decentralized finance and smart contracts, it completely blows it out of the water in terms of the technological advancements in that space. But there's two counters that I have, and I would like to remind you again of the fact that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And number one is that I don't see Bitcoin. I mean, sure, Bitcoin might have been invented as a means to transact, as a currency to use for purposes of transaction. And that might have been its initial purpose, but again, because of the mismanagement of our economy, it's kind of morphed into a store of value, basically a digital gold. So to compare Bitcoin as a currency to another currency coin is a little bit misleading. It's best to think of Bitcoin on its own, in its own field, respective in its own wheelhouse as a store of value, and look at these other coins as currencies for mediums of exchange. So that comparison, it helps you keep it leveled. That's the first point that I have for those people who are against Bitcoin maximalists. The second point about the technological aspects of Bitcoin is that better does not always mean that it will have the widest adoption. And history has shown this, right? Because Bitcoin is not the best technology or the better technology when compared to other coins in terms of its fees, speed, in terms of its layers and all sorts of features it has, like smart contracts or lack thereof. It doesn't have all those gizmos and gadgets, but what it does have is proof of concept and having first mover advantage. And these things are important because look at this. Electric cars actually predated gasoline cars that were powered by the Ford and the Model T. Yet they were cheaper, they were better, they made less noise, they were better for the environment, they had all sorts of advantages, and they were cooler, I would say. But they weren't the one that was widely adopted despite all those advantages, simply because the Model T had other advantages. The assembly line was a revolutionary concept that mass-produced vehicles and was able to satisfy demands. There was a lot of problems in the supply chain with this in terms of getting parts, but also manufacturing the number to meet demands. And we saw the same exact comparison to Beta versus VHS. I mean, VHS was the more archaic, the less funky technology, but nevertheless, it was the one that was widely adopted. And this is basically a historical representation where better technology does not mean it is more the one that is widely acceptable. So you cannot use the fact that Bitcoin is not the better technology to say that it doesn't have a future. Just a word of caution. Going back to the economy and where we're headed. So again, the crash will be coming. There's going to be inflation in between those crashes. Now, when that crash comes, I don't know. I go by the words of Peter Lynch, who is a wise man that says that more money was lost timing the market than has actually been lost in the market. But I think the crash that is going to come is going to be so catastrophic and such a catastrophe that a lot of money will be lost in that, because something has to give. Someone has to pay for the dues that this the federal bankers and the central bankers have passed on to the next generation. The game of musical chairs is coming to an end. When that will come to an end is anyone's guess. But this is a point to say that this is the economy's predictability. I mean, before we could use actual metrics, look at data to say how the economy would go. But now, even analysts at the most renowned hedge funds on Wall Street, who are trained from Ivy League institutions, they have to put all that training aside, and go through FOMC, which is basically the federal bank's monthly meeting minutes, to see what Jerome Powell is thinking. Remember that slide I showed you? It all comes back to Jerome Powell. What he thinks is the way the economy goes. If he decides tomorrow that he's going to raise interest rates, he's going to raise interest rates, and guess what? It's going to tank the economy. We're going to have a 30 to 40% correction, if not more, in the stock market. And what happens is he's going to wipe out your savings. Your savings, your retirement, your kid's college fund is in the hands of one man and one man alone, Jerome Powell. And that's why it's become this, clown market where we have to look at tarot cards or look at the stars to see how it aligns and how to predict the economy and do tea leaf readings, because it all comes back to one man. We have to interpret every word he says in the meetings. We have to interpret his body language. Is he feeling or is he expressing his body language when he says the words interest rates, where it seems more hawkish than dovish? Or is he saying interest rates in a way that it means he's not going to raise it? And that's the clown world we live in. This is a sign of a failing economy, where we have to interpret one man's words like he's Jesus or some religious figure who's reading scripture to see what he means exactly, so we can better hedge ourselves against market movements in one way or another. And this is why it's become this Turkish coffee reading and an exercise of horoscopes and zodiac signs to see what Jerome Powell is thinking or saying or writing. So in summary, it's been a long video, but in summary, I personally believe that my prediction, based on my study of economics and my experience in dealing with this financial markets and whatnot, that the Bitcoin will be the facilitator of transfer of wealth for those people who hedge against it, because there is going to be an economic reckoning. And the people who hedge against that by buying assets, which I would say one of the better assets to own, at least for me, is Bitcoin, is going to have a transfer of wealth in that sense. It's really an equalizer for those who own it. And the sad part to that is, despite this historic transfer of wealth, we're going to, in getting to this, we're going to have in the process more economic inequality to excessive printing and therefore inflation. If the United States currency gets debased as the world's reserve currency, there's going to be political, geopolitical, and foreign policy implications that will have ramifications in Europe with the allies within America's borders. And part of that is economic inequality combined with a lack of hope. Seriously, I mean, when people don't have hope that they're going to get a job, that they're going to get a pay raise, and they're facing inflation and pay cuts and all sorts of expensive items for perishable household goods, such as food, such as rent, such as their car payment, you're going to have political and social instability, and you're going to have more reactionary politicians. And not just in the US. If you thought 2016 was bad, and if you thought extremism was bad, it's going to get way worse. And not just in the US, but worldwide. Remember we said inflation in America gets exported? So those other countries in the world who have their economies tied to the US will also suffer from inflation and all the ills that comes with it. So they too will have more reactionary politics. Look at more reactionary politics in Europe, in Greece. We will see it more and more so. If you thought right now is bad, oh, just wait until what's in store. And a way out of this is going to be a lot of blame game. China's going to blame the US for global instability, while the US will blame China. They're both at fault, but neither of them is going to care. And it might come to head in a potential invasion. I mean, we'll see what happens after the Winter Olympics, but we'll see if there's going to be some potential tensions arising out of Taiwan or other excuses. If we see the U.S. moving out of the Middle East, they for the first time have become energy independent. They now sell more oil than they're buying. So it's no surprise that they're pulling out their military from the Middle East and shifting it elsewhere where they now have present interest, which is the Pacific. Just look at the traffic of ships and aircraft carriers and U.S. troop movements in the Pacific, and you know a greater game is afoot. And in the process of that, we'll see that more countries will ditch the US dollar as it heads towards debasement, because it's becoming more and more worthless, unfortunately, because of the gross mismanagement of central bankers and the Federal Reserve. And until something is done about the central bank and something is done about Jerome Powell and the institution it represents, none of these problems will be going away. And there you have it. If you sticked around this far and watched to this point in the video, thank you. I hope you learned something of value. And I'm not going to be like one of those people who says, you know, hit the subscribe. I could not care less about subscriptions. I don't make money from this channel. It's not my primary source of income. I like just discussing these topics. I enjoy it. It's a hobby of mine, and I do it in my free time when I have free time. And if you have questions or topics you want me to discuss, please send them to me. That's how this video was made. It was a combination of a series of countless questions that was being sent directly by you. And if you have any other questions or topics, do send them to me, and that's what I care about. Another thing I really care about is if you found this video useful and learned something from it, then I've done my job. And really, you don't have to be from America or Canada to really value and get some value from this video. You can be anywhere in Europe, Asia, Latin America, just to become better informed citizens in wherever you are. And even if you learned one thing, that's my job done. And if you became informed, then chances are other people would become informed. So that's what I care about. So if you found this video useful and learned something from it, then do share it with your friends or whoever you think is going to learn something from it, family members, whoever. And that way we can all become better informed. We can spread the word and get informed in becoming better and more engaged citizens, to become aware of the gross incompetence, frankly, of the Federal Reserve and the central bankers, so we can hold their feet to the fire and hold them accountable for the disaster that they have caused and the bigger disaster that is coming in the series of economic crashes. And that is what I care about. So thank you for that. Send questions you got, and take care.